The Mythology of All Races. Volume 3. Celtic, Slavic. Part 1. Celtic Mythology. 1. The Strife of the Gods. The annalistic account of the groups of people who successively came to Ireland, some to perish utterly, others to remain as colonists, represents the unscientific historian's attempt to explain the different races existing there in his time, or of whom tradition spoke. He wrote, too, with an eye upon biblical story, and connected the descendants of the patriarchs with the folk of Ireland. 3 different groups of Noah's lineage arrived in successive waves. The first of these, headed by Noah's granddaughter Cessair, perished, with the exception of a husband. Then came the Fomorians, descendants of Ham, and finally the Nemedians, also of the stock of Noah, arrived. According to one tradition, they, like Cessair's people and another group unconnected with Noah, the race of Bartholan, or Bartholomew, died to a man, although another legend says that they returned to Spain, whence they had come. Spain figures frequently in these annalistic stories, and a close connection between it and Ireland is taken for granted. This may be a reminiscence of a link by way of trade between the two countries in prehistoric days, of which indeed archaeology presents some proof. Possibly, too, early Celtic colonists reached Ireland directly from Spain, rather than through Gaul and Britain. Still, another tradition makes Nemedian survivors wander over the world, some of their descendants becoming the Britons, while others return to Ireland as a new colonizing group, Firblogs, Firdomman, and Galioin. A third group of their descendants who had learned magic came to Ireland, the Tuatha De Danann. Finally, the Milesians, the ancestors of the Irish, arrived and conquered the Tuatha De Danann, as these had defeated the Fomorians. Little of this is actual history, but how much of it is invention, and how much is based on mythic traditions floating down from the past, is uncertain. What is certain is that the annalists, partly as a result of the euhemerizing process, partly through misunderstanding, mingled groups of gods with tribes or races of men, and regarded them as more or less human. These various traditions are introductory to the story of the 2 battles of Mag Tuired, enlarged from an earlier tale of a single conflict. An interval of 27 years elapsed between the 2 battles, and they were fought in different parts of Ireland bearing the same name, one in Mayo and the other in Sligo, the first battle being fought against the Firblogs and the second against the Fomorians by the Tuatha De Danann. Having reached Ireland, the Tuatha De Danann established themselves at Magrain in Connaught. The Firblogs sent a huge warrior, Sreng, to parley with them, and to him approached Bres, son of Elatha, of the Tuatha De Danann. The warriors gazed long upon each other. Then they mutually admired their weapons, and finally exchanged them, Bres receiving the heavy, broad-pointed spears of the Firblog, and Sreng the light, sharp-pointed lances of Bres. The demand of the invaders was surrender to the half of Ireland, but to this the Firblogs would not agree. Meanwhile, the Tuatha De Danann, terrified at the heavy Firbolg spears, retreated to Mag Tuired. Badb, Morrigan, and Macha, 3 of their women, producing frogs, rain of fire, and streams of blood against the Firbolgs. By mutual agreement, an armistice was arranged for preparation, and some from each side even engaged in a hurling match. Such were the tactics of the time. Each party prepared a healing well for the wounded, in which medicinal herbs were placed. Dagda led the forces on the first day, when the Tuatha De Danann were defeated. But under the command of Ogma, Midir, Bod Dearg, Dian Ekchekt, Aingaba of Norway, Badb, Macha, Morrigan, and Danann, they were successful on the second day. On the third day, Dagda again led. For in me you have an excellent God. On the fourth day, Badba, Bledlochtana, and Amaite Eidgil, furies, monsters, hags of doom, cried aloud, and their voices resounded in the rocks, waterfalls, and hollows of the earth. Sreng severed the arm of Nuada, king of the Tuatha De Danann. Bres was slain by Eochaid, who, overpowered by thirst, sought water throughout Ireland. But the wizards of the Tuatha De Danann hid all streams from him, and he was slain. The Firbolgs, reduced to 300, were still prepared to fight, but when the Tuatha De Danann offered them peace and the province of Connaught, this was accepted. As we shall see, the Tuatha De Danann were gods, and their strife against the Firbolgs, a non-Celtic group, is probably based on a tradition of war between incoming Celts and Aborigines. Meanwhile, the Tuatha De Danann made alliance with the Fomorians. Ethne, daughter of Balor, married Cian, son of Dian Cecht, her son being the famous Lug. Nuada's mutilation prevented his continuing as king, for no maimed person could reign, and the women insisted that the Fomorian Bres, their adopted son, should receive the throne, since he was son of Elatha, the Fomorian king. Eri, sister of Elatha, was counted of the Tuatha De Danann, perhaps because their mother was also of them, an instance of succession through the female line. And this would account for Bres becoming king, though these genealogies are doubtless inventions of the annalists. Bres was son of Elatha and Eri. Such unions of brother and sister, or half-sister, are common in mythology, and were not unknown in royal houses. Example, in Egypt and Peru, as a means of keeping the dynasty pure. One day, Eri saw a silver boat approaching. A noble warrior with golden locks stepped ashore, clad in an embroidered mantle and wearing a jeweled golden brooch, and 5 golden torques round his neck. He carried 2 silvery pointed spears with bronze shafts, and a golden hilted sword inlaid with silver. Eri was so overcome by his appearance that she easily surrendered to him and wept bitterly when he rose to leave her. Then he drew from his finger a golden ring and bade her not part with it, save to one whose finger it should fit. Elatha was his name, and she would bear a son Eochaid Bres, or the Beautiful. At 7 years old, Bres was as a boy of 14. Bres was miserly and caused much murmuring among the Tuatha De Danann. Their knives were not greased by him, and however often they visited him, their breaths did not smell of ale. No poets, bards, or musicians were in his household, and no champions proved their prowess, save Ogma, who had the slavish daily task of carrying a load of fuel, 2/3 of which were swept from him by the sea, because he was weak through hunger. Bres claimed the milk of all brown, hairless cows, and when these proved to be few in number, he caused the kine of Munster to pass through a fire of bracken so that they might become hairless and brown. This tale being possibly connected with the ritual passing of cattle through fires at Beltane on May Day. Another version of the tale, however, makes it less pleasant for Bres. He demanded 100 men's drink from the milk of a hornless dun cow, or a cow of some other colour, from every house in Ireland. But by the advice of Lug and Findgol, Nectan, king of Munster, singed the kine in a fire of fern and smeared them with a porridge of flaxseed. 300 wooden cows with dark brown pails in lieu of udders were made, and the pails were dipped in black bog stuff. When Bress inspected them, the bog stuff was squeezed out like milk. But since he was under gaze or taboo to drink whatever was milked, the result of his swallowing so much bog stuff was a gradual wasting away, until he died when traversing Ireland to seek a cure. Stokes conjectures that Bress required the milk of one-coloured cows as a means of removing his wife's barrenness. Another account of Bress's death tells how Courtrai, the poet, came to his house. It was narrow, dark, and fireless, and for food the guest received only 3 small unbuttered cakes. Next morning, filled with the poet's scorn, he chanted a satire. Without food quickly on a dish, without a cow's milk whereon a calf grows, without a man's abode under the gloom of night, without paying a company of storytellers, let that be the condition of Bress. This was the first satire made in Ireland, but it had all the effect which later belief attributed to satire, and Bress declined from that hour. Surrendering his sovereignty and going to his mother, he asked whence was his origin. And when she tried the ring on his finger, she found that it fitted him. Bress and she then went to the Fomorians' land, where his father recognized the ring and upbraided Bress for leaving the kingdom. Bress acknowledged the injustice of his rule, but asked his father's help, whereupon Elatha sent him to Balor, grandson of Net, the Fomorian war god, and to Indech, who assembled a huge force in order to impose their rule on the Tuatha De Danann. Some curious incidents may be mentioned here. While Bress ruled, the Fomorian kings, Indech, Elatha, and Tethra, bound tribute on Ireland and reduced some of the Tuatha De Danann to servitude. The Fomorians had formerly exacted tribute of the Nemedians, and it was collected by one of their women in an iron vessel, 50 fills of corn and milk, of butter, and of flour. This may be a memory of sacrifice. Ogma had to carry fuel, and even Dagda was obliged to become a builder of rats, or forts. In a house where he lived was a lampooner named Credenbel, who demanded from him the 3 best bits of his ration, and thus Dagda's health suffered. But Oengus, Dagda's son, hearing of this, gave him 3 gold coins to put into Credenbel's potion. These would cause his death, and Bress would be told that Dagda had poisoned him. Then he must tell the story to Bress, who would cause the lampooner's stomach to be opened, and if the gold were not found there, Dagda would have to die. In the sequel, Oengus advised Dagda to ask as reward for his wrath building only a black-maned heifer. And although this seemed weakness to Bress, the astuteness of Oengus was seen when, after the second battle, the heifer's lowing brought to Dagda the cattle exacted by the Fomorians. This mythical story of Bress's sovereignty and of the servitude of beings who are gods is probably parallel to other myths of the temporary eclipse of deities, as when the Babylonian high gods were afraid of Tiamat and her brood, or cowered in terror before the flood. It may also represent an old nature dualism, the apparent paralysis of gods of sunshine and fruitfulness in the death and cold of winter. Or it may hint at some temporary defeat of Celtic invaders, which even their gods seem to share. Whatever the Fomorians be, their final defeat was at hand. When Bress retired, Nuada was again made king because his hand was restored. Deanchecht, a divinity of leechcraft, as assisted by Craidne, god of smithwork, made for him a silver hand. But Miach, the untouched son, not content with this, obtained the mutilated hand, and by means of such a spell as is common to many races, joint to joint, sinew to sinew, he set it to the stump, causing skin to grow, and restored the hand. In another version, he made a new arm with a swineherd's arm bone. Through envy, Dayanshek struck Miach 4 blows, 3 of which Miach healed, but the 4th was fatal. His father buried him, and from his grave sprang as many herbs as he had joints and sinews. Airmed, his sister, separated them according to their properties, but Dayanshek confused them so that none might know their right values. These incidents reflect beliefs about magico-medical skill, and the last may be a myth of divine jealousy at man's obtaining knowledge. Nuada now made a feast for the gods, and as they banqueted, a warrior coming to the portal bade the doorkeepers announce him as Lug, son of Chian, son of Dayanshek, and of Ethne, Balor's daughter. He was also known as Samildanak, or possessing many arts, and when asked what he practiced, he answered that he was a carpenter, only to hear the doorkeeper reply, "Already we have a carpenter." In succession he declared himself smith, champion, harper, hero, poet, magician, leech, cupbearer, and brazier, but the Tuatha De Danann possessed each one of these. Lug, however, because he knew all these arts, gained entrance and among other feats played the 3 magic harp strains so often referred to in Irish text: sleep strain, wail strain, and laughter strain, which in turn caused slumber, mourning, and joy. In another version of Lug's coming from the children of Tuiren, as he approached, like the setting sun was the splendor of his countenance, and none could gaze on it. His army was the fairy cavalcade from the land of promise, and with them were his foster brothers, Manannan's sons. Lug rode Manannan's steed Enbar, fleet as the spring wind, and on whose back no rider could be killed. He wore Manannan's lorica, which preserved from wounds, his breastplate, which no weapon could pierce, and his sword, the wound of which none survived, while the strength of all who faced it became weakness. When the Fomorians came for tribute, Lug killed some of them, whereupon Balor's wife, Kethleon, told him that this was their grandson, and that it had been prophesied that when he arrived, the power of the Fomorians would depart. As Lug went to meet the Fomorians, Bress was surprised that the sun seemed rising in the west, but his druid said that this was the radiance from the face of Lug, who cast a spell on the cattle taken for tribute, so that they returned to the Tuatha De Danann. When his fairy cavalcade arrived, Bress begged his life on condition of bringing over the Fomorians, while he offered sun, moon, sea, and land as guarantees that he would not again fight. And to this Lug agreed. The guarantee points to an animistic view of nature, for it means that sun, etc. would punish Bress if he was unfaithful. To return to the other account, Nuada gave Lug his throne, and for a year the gods remained in council, consulting the wizards, leeches, and smiths. Mathgen the wizard announced that the mountains would aid them and that he would cast them on the Fomorians. The cupbearer said that through his power the Fomorians would find no water in Lo or river. Figol the druid promised to rain showers of fire on the foe and to remove from them 2/3 of their might, while increase of strength would come to the Tuatha De Danann, who would not be weary if they fought 7 years. Dagda said that he would do more than all the others together. For 7 years weapons were prepared under the charge of Lug. At this point comes the episode of Dagda's assignation with the war goddess Morrigan, who was washing in a river, one foot at Ecumek in the north, the other at Lusquin in the south. This enormous size is a token of divinity in Celtic myths, and the place where Dagda and Morrigan met was now known as the couple's bed. She bade him summon the men of knowledge, and to them she gave 2 handfuls of the blood of Indech's heart, of which she had deprived him, as well as valour from his kidneys. These men now chanted spells against the Fomorians, a practice invariably preceding battle among the Celts. Another incident shows that the Celts, like other races, could recount irreverent stories about their gods. Dagda had been sent to spy out the Fomorians' camp and to ask a truce. Much porridge was made for him, boiled with goats, sheep, and swine, and the mess being poured into a hole in the ground, he was bidden to eat it under pain of death. Taking a ladle big enough for a man and a woman to lie in, he began his meal and ate it all, after which sleep overcame him, and the Fomorians mocked his distended paunch. When he rose, uneasy was his movement, but he bravely bore his huge branched fork or club, dragging it till its track was like a boundary ditch, so that men called that the track of Dagda's club. An obscene story follows regarding his amour with Indech's daughter, who agreed to practice magic against her father's army. Before the battle, each chief promised Lugh prodigies of valour, craftsmanship, or magic, weapons and armour in unfailing abundance, enfeeblement and destruction of the enemy, the power of satire upon them, magical healing of wounded or slain. Lugh's 2 witches said, "We will enchant the trees and the stones and the sods of the earth, so that they shall become a host under arms against the foe." But Lugh was prevented from going to the fray, because they feared an early death for the hero owing to the multitude of his arts. Preliminary combats occurred in which the superior magic of the Tuatha De Danann was apparent. Weapons were restored or new ones made in a twinkling by Goibniu, Luchtin, and Craidne. Goibniu, Old Irish Goba, or smith, had promised that though the battle lasted 7 years, he would replace every broken sword or spearhead. No spearhead forged by him would miss, and none whom it pierced would continue in life. He kept his promise, making weapons by 3 turns in his forge, and renewed the blunted or broken instruments of war. Elsewhere we learned that Goibniu's immortal ale, like nectar and soma, made the divinities immortal, so that he is the equivalent of the Greek Hephaestus, god of craftsmen, who poured out nectar for the gods at their banquet, and of the Vedic deity Thwatsur, who made the cup from which the gods drank. Why divine smiths should be associated with the drink of the gods is not clear, but probably we have here different forms of a myth common to the Indo-European peoples. Goibniu is still remembered in Irish folk tales. Craidne, the Kurd or brazier, promised to supply rivets for the spears, hilts for the swords, and bosses and rims for the shields. He made the rivets in 3 turns and cast the rings to them. Craidne, whom euhemerizing tradition described as having been drowned while bringing golden ore from Spain to Ireland, may be compared with Len Linfiach Clach, Kurd of the god Bob, who lived in Loch Lane, making the bright vessels of Fand, daughter of Flidais. Every evening he threw his anvil eastward as far as a grave mound at Indewin, and it in turn cast 3 showers toward the grave, of water, of fire, and of purple gems. Luchtha the carpenter promised to supply all the shields and javelin shafts required for the battle. These shafts he made with 3 chippings, the third completing them and setting them in the rings of the spears, or he threw them with marvelous accuracy at the sockets of the spear heads stuck by Goibniu in the door lintels, this being precisely paralleled by the art of Ceollt, the survivor of the fane. The mortally wounded were placed in a well over which Dayan Shecht and his children sang spells, or into which he put healing herbs, and thus they became whole. The Fomorians sent Ruadan, son of Bress and of Brig, daughter of Dagda, to discover the reason of these things, and a second time he was sent to kill one of the divine craftsmen. He obtained one of the magic spears and wounded Goibniu, who slew Ruadan and then entered the healing well, while Brig bewailed her son with the first death-keen heard in Ireland. Here, as so often, the origin of mourning chants and runes is ascribed to divinities. Before the battle, Lugh escaped from his guards and heartened the host by circumambulating them on one foot with one eye closed, chanting a spell for their protection, the attitude of the savage medicine man, probably signifying concentration. Then came the clash of battle, gory, shivering, crowded, sanguineous, the river ran in corpses of foes. Nuada and Macha were slain by Balor, who possessed an evil eye, or was a personification of the evil eye, so much feared by the Celts. Once when his father's druids were concocting magic potions, the fumes gave his eye poisonous power, and his eyelid was raised by 4 men, but only on the battlefield, where no army could resist it. When Lugh appeared, Balor desired it to be lifted, but Lugh cast a stone at the eye, so that it was carried through his head, blasting some of his own men. In a ballad account of this, Balor was beheaded by Lugh, but asked him to set the head upon his own and earn his blessing. Fortunately for himself, however, Lugh set it on a hazel, and it dropped poison which split the hazel in 2. The tree became the abode of vultures and ravens for many years, until Manannán caused it to be dug up, when a poisonous vapour from its roots killed and wounded many of the workmen. Of the wood, Luchta made a shield for Manannán, which became one of the famous shields of Erin. It could not be touched in battle, and it always caused utter rout. Finally, it became Fionn's shield. The war goddess Morrigan sang a magic rune to hearten the host, and the battle became a rout for the Fomorians, though not before Ogma and Indech had fallen in single combat. Bress was found unguarded by Lugh and others, and made 3 offers for his life. But 2 of these, that Ireland's kine should always be in milk, and that corn would be reaped every quarter, were rejected. Life was offered him, however, if he would tell how the men of Erin should plough, sow, and reap. And when Bress said that these things should always be done on a Tuesday, he was set free. In another account, 4 Fomorians escaped, ruining corn, milk, fruit, and sea produce. But on November Eve, on Samhain, they were expelled by Bod, Midir, Oengus, and the Morrigan, so that never more should their depredations occur. This points to the conception of the Fomorians as powers of blight. That of Bress suggests rather that they were pre-Celtic gods of fertility. 2 curious incidents, revealing the magic powers of weapons which were worshipped by the Celts and of musical instruments, occur here. Ogma captured the sword of the war god Tethra, and when unsheathed it, told the deeds it had done, as was the custom with swords in those days. For, as the Christian compiler adds, the reason why demons spake from weapons was because weapons were then worshipped and acted as safeguards. The other incident tells how Dagda's harp was carried off and was found by Lug, Ogma, and Dagda in the house where Bress and his friends were. No melody would sound from it until Dagda uttered a charm. But then the harp came to him, killing 9 men on its way, after which he played the 3 magic strains of sleep, mourning, and laughter. This harp resembles that of Teirtu in the Welsh tale of Culhwch and Olwen, which played or stopped playing of itself when so desired. Thus the Tuatha De Danann conquered, and the Morrigan proclaimed the victory to the royal heights of Ireland, its hosts of the Sid, its chief waters, and its river mouths, a reminiscence of the animistic view or of the personalization of nature. Then she sang of the world's end and of the evils to come, one of the few eschatological references in Irish mythology, though it is most likely of Christian origin. This curious story is undoubtedly based on old myths of divine wars, but what these denoted is uncertain. Both Tuatha De Danann and Fomorians are superhuman. Vaguely, we discern behind the legend a strife of anthropomorphic figures of summer, light, growth, and order, with powers of winter, darkness, blight, and disorder. Such powers agree, but ill. There is strife between them, as, to the untutored eye, there is strife in the parts of nature for which they stand. And this apparent dualism is reflected on the life of the beings who represent the powers of nature. All mythologies echo the strife. The Babylonian Marduk and the gods battle with Tiamat and her brood. Gods and Titans, or Jotuns, Re and Apop, fight, and those hostile to gods of light and growth. Gods dear to man's heart are represented in demoniac guise. If Tuatha De Danann and Fomorians were both divine but hostile groups of the Irish Celts, the sinister character of the latter would not be forgotten by the annalists, who regarded both with puzzled eyes and sought vainly to envisage them as mortals. Or again, the two may be hostile sets of deities, because divinities respectively of Celts and Aborigines. The Fomorians are, in fact, called gods of the menial Firbolgs, who are undoubtedly an aboriginal race, while Fomorians are described in later Christian times as ungracious and demoniac, unlike the Tuatha De Danann. And the pagan Celts must already have regarded them as evil. The gods of a conquering race are often regarded as hostile to those of the Aborigines, and vice versa. And now new myths arise. In either case, the close relationship in which the groups stand by marriage or descent need not be an invention of the compiler. Pagan mythology is inconsistent, and compromise is inevitable. Conquerors and conquered tend to coalesce, and this is true of their gods, or, as different tribes of one race now intermarry, now fight, so also may their evil and their friendly divinities. Zeus was son of the Titan Cronos, yet hostile to him. Vili, Ve, and Odin, father of the gods, were sons of a giant, and the gods fought with giants. Other parallels might be cited, but what is certain is that gods of an orderly world, of growth, craftsmanship, medicine, poetry, and eloquence, is also of magic and war, are opposed to beings envisaged, on the whole, as harmful. In this combat, some of the gods are slain. If this were told of them in the old myths, probably it did not affect the continuance of their cult. Pagan gods are mortal and immortal. Their life is a perennial drama, which ever begins and ends, and is ever being renewed, a reflection of the life of nature itself. In another story, the strife of powers of light and growth with those of darkness and blight is suggested, though the latter are euphemistically described as mortals. 3 men came from Athens with their mother Carmen, valiant, black, and evil, sons of extinction, who was son of darkness, and he son of ailment. By her incantations, Carmen ruined every place where she came, while her sons destroyed through plundering and dishonesty. They came to Ireland to blight the corn of the Tuatha De Danann, who sent against them Ai, a poet, Credenbel the lampooner, Lug Laibach, a wizard, and Bechuel, a witch, some of whom have already played a part in the story of Mac Tuired. By spells they drove the men oversea, but not until they gave the 7 things which they served as security that they would not return, and left their mother as a hostage. She died of grief, begging the gods to hold an annual festival at a burial place and to call it by her name. And as long as they kept it, the Leinster men were promised plenty of corn, fruit, milk, and fish. No explanation is given as to what the mysterious 7 things were. In other tales, groups of gods are seen at strife with each other, and in their conflict they were sometimes not too mighty to seek the help of heroes. An example of this occurs in the story of Cuchulainn's visit to Elysium. In spite of the prowess of the god Labraid, sung by the goddess Fand and Liban, the time has come when he must give battle to supernatural foes. Sinach the unearthly, Eochaid, Eol, and Eogan the stream, the last mentioned in the Book of Invasions, as hostile to the Tuatha De Danann. These were united, apparently, with Manannan, whose consort Fand, Labraid's sister, had left him. Labraid was afraid, for the contest would be of doubtful issue. Glad indeed would be he of the hero Cuchulainn's aid, and for that assistance he was willing to give him his sister Fand. When Cuchulainn arrived in the god's domain and was welcomed by Labraid, they gazed on the vast armies of the foe, while 2 ravens, skilled in druidic secrets, announced the hero's presence to the hosts. Next morning, Eochaid went to wash at the stream, when Cuchulainn slew him, and a great fight followed between Cuchulainn and Senach, who also was slain. Cuchulainn then put forth all his might, and so great was the carnage that Labraid himself entreated him to end it. And then Labraid sang, "A mighty host, with multitudes of horses, attacked me on every side. They were the people of Manannan, son of the sea, whom Eogan had called to his aid." Another instance occurs in the story of Loigeire, son of the king of Connaught. The people of Connaught were met in assembly near the Loch of the Birds in the plain of Ai, when a stranger approached them through the mist which rose from the lake. He wore a purple cloak, and his yellow hair fell upon his shoulders. A golden-hilted sword hung at his side. In his right hand he carried a 5-pointed spear, and on his left arm a shield with a golden boss. Loigeir welcomed him, and he told how he had come from the god's land to seek the aid of warriors. Fiachna was his name, and he had slain his wife's ravisher, but had been attacked by his nephew Gol, son of the king of the fort of Magmel, and in 7 battles had been vanquished, so that in view of a new conflict he had come for succor. He sang of the beauty of the land and of the bloody combats fought there among the people of majestic race, and how silver and gold awaited those who would help him. Beautiful were the divine warriors, with blue eyes of powerful sight, teeth brilliant as glass, and red lips. Mighty in conflict, in their assemblies they sang in melodious verse of learned matters. Fiachna disappeared into the lake, and now Loigeir appealed to his men. 50 warriors plunged with him into the water, and in the divine land under the loch joined Fiachna against his foe, besieging the fort of Magmel, where his wife was a prisoner. The defenders released her, and she followed the vanquishers, singing of her love for gold. Fiachna gave his daughter, son Tia, to Loiger, and each of his men also received a wife. For a year they remained in the divine land, until they became homesick. And as they left him, Fiachna bade them mount on horseback and not alight on the earth, if they wished to return to him. The people of Connaught rejoiced to see them again, for sorely had they mourned them. But now Loiger renounced their return to the god's land, nor would he remain, although his father offered him the kingdom, its gold, and its women. The unmoved sun sang of the divine land, where beer fell in showers, and every army was of 100,000 warriors, while as one went from kingdom to kingdom, the melodious music of the gods was heard. He told of his goddess wife and those of his comrades, and of the cauldrons and drinking horns taken from the fort. For one night of the nights of the Cid, he would not accept his father's kingdom. With these words he quitted the king forever, and returned to Magmel, there to share the sovereignty with Fiachna, a noble divine reward to a mortal. In the heroic cycle of Fionn, other instances of heroes helping gods will be found. War between different divine groups is also found in the story of Caibel and Etar, kings of the Sidhe, divine or fairy folk, each of whom had a beautiful daughter. Two kings who sought the maidens in marriage were offered battle for them. If, however, the combat was fought in the Cid would be polluted, an idea contrary to that of these other instances of war in the god's land. And if the Cid folk were seen among men, they would no longer be invisible at will. The fight, therefore, took place at night, lest there should be no distinction between men and them. And the Sidhe took the form of deer. So terrible was the struggle that 4 hillocks were made of the hoofs and antlers of the slain, and to quell it, water broke forth from a well and formed Loch Riach, into which, if white sheep are cast every 7th year at the proper hour, they become crimson. Etar alone of the kings survived. The Christian scribes were puzzled over the Tuatha De Danann. The earliest reference to them says that because of their knowledge they were banished from heaven, arriving in Ireland in clouds and mists. The smoke of their burning ships, says a new Hemerizing tradition. Yochid Ua Flame, in the 10th century, calls them phantoms, Siabra, and asks whether they came from heaven or earth, were they demons or men. They were affiliated to Yaphet, yet regarded as demons in the Book of Invasions. Another tradition makes them a branch of the descendants of Nemed, who, after being in the Northern Isles learning wizardry, returned to Ireland. The annalists treated them more or less as men, official Christianity more or less as demons, popular belief and romance as a kind of beautiful fairy race with much of their old divine aspect. Diabwa translates Tuatha De Danann as people of the god whose mother is called Danu. Stokes renders it folk or folks of the goddess Danu. Stern prefers to regard Danann as a later addition and to take the earlier name as Tuatha De or Firdia, the divine tribe, or the men of the god. 3 insignificant members of the group, Brian, Euchar, and Eucharba, are sometimes called 3 gods of Danu, and hence also perhaps the whole group is designated men of the 3 gods. Brian, Euchar, and Eucharba are also termed 3D Dana, or 3 gods of Dan, that is, knowledge, or fate. Danand, or Danu, is mentioned with Beothil as a separate goddess, and both are called foster mothers of the gods. Cormac's glossary knows nothing of Danu, but speaks of a goddess Anu. It was well she nursed the gods, while he refers to two hills in Kerry as the Paps of Anu, which a later glossary calls the Paps of Danu. Ireland is called Iat Nianan, and Anu is mentioned with Macha, Morrigan, and Bab, the war goddess, though other passages give Danu along with these. Possibly Danu is a mistake for Anu, through confusion with Dan, or knowledge, knowledge as a function of Brian, Ucha, and Uchaba being personified as Danu, so that they would then be called gods or sons of Danu, though they were actually sons of Bridget. As Stern points out, Danu can scarcely be mother of the whole group, since she herself is daughter of Delbaith, who was brother of Dagda, Ogma, Bres, etc. If Anu was mother of the group, the likeness of her name to Danu would also lead to the mistake. And Anu as goddess is perhaps a personification of Ireland, a kind of earth mother. On the whole, the general relationship of the euhemerized gods evolved by the annalists is as mythical as the pagan stories themselves. In the story of the children of Tuiren, Brian, Ucher, and Ucharpa are sons of Tuiren, son of Ogma. One day Cian, at enmity with them, saw them approaching. Striking himself with a druidic wand, he became a pig. But Brian noticed this and changed himself and his brothers into hounds, which chased and killed Cian with stones, because he said that weapons would tell the deed to his son. They buried his body 7 times ere the earth ceased to reject it. Lug, Cian's son, was told of this deed by the earth, and he forced the children of Turin to bring many magical treasures, in getting which danger was incurred. By their father's advice, they crossed the sea in Manannan's canoe and succeeded in obtaining the treasures, but now had to give 3 shouts on Knock Miod Cowin, a hill on which Miod Cowin and his sons prohibited all shouting. Here then they were wounded by these men, and their father asked Lug for the magic pig skin, which healed all wounds. He refused it, even when Brian was carried before him, and thus the murderers perished miserably. Most of the names of the chief gods have already been mentioned. Dagda, or Eochaid Ulathair, who in one place is called an earth god to the Tuatha De Danann, and also their god of wizardry, probably a deity of fruitfulness and fertility. Oengus, Nuada, Ogma, god of poetry, Goibniu, god of smiths, Creidne of braziers, Dianshect of medicine, Manannan, son of Ler, Medir, Bod Diarg, Lug, perhaps a sun god, and other lesser divinities. Of goddesses, there are Anu or Danu, Bridget, goddess of poetry and primitive culture, Etain, and the war goddesses, Morrigan, Macha, and Neman, while Bad constitutes a 4th or sometimes takes the place of one of the triple group. The Tuatha De Danann had power over agriculture and cattle, but they had other functions, while one of them had great magic potency. Unfortunately, few myths about these functions exist, and their precise nature must be matter of conjecture. The mythico-magical nature of the gods' possession survives even in records which regard them as mortals. The preface to the story of the Battle of Macturet tells how from Phalius was brought the stone of Phal, which rode under every king who would assume the sovereignty. From Gorius was brought Lug's spear. No battle was ever won against it or against him who bore it. From Findius came Nuada's sword, which none could escape when it was drawn. From Morius came Dagda's cauldron, from which no company ever went away unthankful. Their magic food and other possessions will be mentioned later. Some things of which no myths remain are said to have been in the Brugna Boyne, the bed of Dagda, the 2 paps of Morrigan, the comb and casket of Dagda's wife, that is, 2 hills, the stone wall of Oengus, the shot of Midirsai, and the like. Chapter 2. Tuatha De Danann and Milesians. The annalistic account of the conquest of the Tuatha De Danann by the Milesians cannot conceal the divinity of the former, nor the persistence of the belief in druidic magic and supernatural power. Diabois has shown that the scheme which makes the Tuatha De Danann masters of Ireland for 169 years, until the Milesians came, is the invention of Gilla Coimin, who died in 1072 AD. The Book of Invasions adopted it, and it assumes that the gods reigned in succession as kings until 1700 BC. Even in Gilla Coimin's time, however, this scheme was not always accepted, for Tigernach in his annals knows no historic Irish date before 305 BC, while current tales showed that the gods were still alive at a much later date. Example, in the time of Conchobar and Cuchulainn, alleged Irish contemporaries of Christ. When the Milesians arrived, 3 kings of the Tuatha De Danann ruled: Macquill, son of the Hazel, Macchecht, son of the Plough, and Macgrain, son of the Sun. Married respectively to Banba, Fotla, and Eriu, whose names are ancient names of Ireland, the last still surviving as Erin. Were these old eponymous goddesses from whom parts of Ireland were supposed to have taken their names, or were the inventions of the annalists derived from titles given to the country? The former is suggested by an incident in the story. The 3 kings may have been gods of nature and agriculture, and in fighting the Milesians, they were respectively slain by Eber, Airem, or plowman, and Amairgen, singer of spells and giver of judgments. The Milesians were descendants of a Scythian noble expelled from Egypt, who came to Spain, where his descendant Bregon built a tower and was father or grandfather of Mael, whose father is sometimes called Bail. Another son, Ith, gazing one evening from the tower, saw the coast of Ireland. With 90 followers he sailed thither and was welcomed by the kings, who begged him to settle a dispute. Very different was his fate from that of folk-tale heroes called in to adjust quarrels. While bidding the kings act according to justice, he so praised the fertility of the land that they suspected him of designs upon it and slew him. His followers carried his body to Spain, and the chief of the Milesians, resolving to avenge him, sailed to Ireland. But the Tuatha De Danann made a magic mist, so that the island appeared like a hog's back. Hence its name, Muig Innis, or Pig Island. At last they landed, and the poet Amairgen, son of Mael, sang: I am a wind at sea, I am a wave of the sea, I am a roaring of the sea. I am an ox in strength, I am a bird of prey on a cliff, I am a ray of the sun. I am an intelligent navigator, I'm a bow of fierceness. I'm a lake on a plain. I'm an effective artist. I'm a giant with a sharp sword hewing down an army, etc. Some see in this a species of Celtic pantheism, but if so, it is pantheism of a curious kind, for it is, rather, the vainglorious bombast of the Celt, to which there are parallels in Welsh poems, where Taliesin speaks of the successive forms which he has assumed. The comparison should not be made with the pantheism of the Irishman Eddie Genna, but with the bragging utterances of savage medicine men. The Milesians met in succession, Banba, Fotla, and Eriu, each of whom asked that they would call the isle after her name. The kings then begged an armistice, ostensibly to discuss the question of battle or capitulation, but really in order to give their druids time to prepare incantations, while they agreed to accept the judgment of Amergen, save that, if it were false, he must die. Amergen then told the Milesians that they must embark for the magic distance of 9 waves, and if they succeeded in returning, the land would be theirs. This was the first judgment ever given in Ireland. The Milesians now returned to their ships, but no sooner had they gained the desired distance than the druids and poets of the gods raised a storm. Eber recognized it as a druidic storm, which did not rage beyond the top of the masts, and Amergen now invoked the aid of the natural features of Erin, an archaic animistic rune, embedded in the later story, and one which preserves a primitive stage of thought. I invoke thee, Erin, brilliant, brilliant sea, fertile, fertile hill, wood with valleys, flowing, flowing stream, etc. Now the storm ceased, and Eber joyfully boasted that he would strike the people of Erin with spear and sword. But that moment the tempest burst forth again, scattering and wrecking the ships, and drowning many. The survivors landed at the Boyne and gave battle to the Tuatha De Danann. The 3 queens are said to have created a magic army which was a delusion to the Milesians, as Lug's witches had done to the Fomorians. But in spite of this, the Tuatha De Danann were defeated. We boldly gave battle to the sprites Siabra of the Isle of Banba, of which 1,000 fell together, by us, of the Tuatha De Danann. At another conflict, a further rout took place, in which the 3 kings and queens were slain, and it was now that the survivors of the Tuatha De Danann took refuge in the underground Sid, the Milesians remaining masters of Ireland. On whatever this account is based, it is not itself an ancient pagan myth, for gods worshipped by men are not defeated by them or by their superstitious ancestors. By the annalists, real races, imaginary races, and divine groups were regarded more or less from one standpoint. All were human and might be made to fight each other. Next came the question, how were the old gods abandoned? And why had they been, or were even now, supposed popularly to live in the Sid? It was known that the Christianized tribes had forsaken the gods, though these had come to be regarded by them as a kind of fairy race living out of sight, to whom in time of need and sub rosa they might appeal. Obviously then, Christianity must have caused their defeat. To this idea we may trace one source of the account just summarized. It is, in effect, what is said in the Colloquy with the Ancients, in which, regardless of the annalistic scheme, the gods are powerful long after their supposed defeat. Cawilde, survivor of the Fane into the days of Saint Patrick, says that soon the Tuatha De Danann will be reduced in power, for the saint will relegate them to the foreheads of hills and rocks, unless that now and again thou see some poor one of them appear as transiently he revisits the earth, that is, the haunts of men. Hence, perhaps, the colloquy elsewhere represents them as possessing not so much land as will support themselves. In St. Patrick's life, this victory is dramatically represented. He went to Mag Slacht, where stood an image of Ken Cruach, head of the mound, covered with gold and silver, and 12 others covered with bronze. The chief image bowed downward when he raised his crozier, and the earth swallowed the others, while their indwelling demons, cursed by the saint, fled to the hill. Why then was the defeat ascribed to the Milesians? Of the different hostile Celtic groups dwelling in different parts of Ireland, 2 at last became preeminent shortly before St. Patrick's time, governed by great dynastic families and reigning respectively at Cashel and Tara. It was for their aggrandizement that the legend of descent from Mile and his ancestors was invented. But as the gods had come to be regarded as a powerful race who had conquered earlier races in Ireland, so it became necessary to show that the Milesians had overcome them. This pushed the Milesians back to remote antiquity and showed that they had been masters of Ireland since 1700 BC, while the Tuatha De Danann, whose power had passed at the coming of Christianity, were now alleged to have been conquered by them. Thus, the central theory of those medieval reconstructors of Irish history was that Ireland had been subjected to the Milesian race for ages before the Christian era. Later, the Ulster heroes were brought into relationship with Mile, as at last were all the Irish aristocracy. Mile, Latin miles or soldier, and bile are men of straw with no place in the older mythology, and hence the attempts of Rhys and Diarbois to equate Bile with Balor and with the Celtic Despater, as god of death and ancestors of the Celts, are nothing but modern mythologizing. The account of the conquest doubtless made use of earlier conceptions of supernatural power and magic, while still apt to consider the Tuatha De Danann as somehow different from men, Siabra, sprites, this being the popular view and also current in literary tales embodying older myths. The gods were a superhuman race, the Sidhe, helping men on occasion, and this influenced the official view, for euhemeristic documents tell how, after their defeat, the Tuatha De Danann retired to subterranean palaces, emerging now and then to help or to harm mortals. Even the Milesians were not yet free of their power, especially that of Dagda. Their corn and milk were being destroyed by the Tuatha De Danann, and to prevent this in future they made friends with Dagda, so that now these things were spared to them. This story seems to be the late form of the earlier mythic idea that corn and milk depend on the gods, who, when offended by men, withhold these gifts. They were also obtained by sacrifice, example, by offerings of children and animal firstlings to Ken Cruach. And elsewhere we find that the Fomorians exacted 2/3 of their corn and milk annually from the Nemedians. Perhaps there is here a mingling of the idea of destruction by gods of blight with that of the withholding of such gifts and with that of the offering of these things. A survival of such sacrifices occurs in the food and milk left out for the fairies in Ireland and in the West Highlands. The functions of some of the divinities as controllers of fertility are suggested by references of this character, as well as by the symbols on Gaulish monuments, and some folklore collected by Mr. D. Fitzgerald in Limerick shows how the memory of these functions vaguely persisted under a romantic dress. Nok Ain, or Nokaini, or Aine's Hill, has always been considered the dwelling of Aine, queen of the fairies of South Munster and daughter of Eogabal of the Tuatha De Danann. Aine, the best-hearted woman that ever lived, is still seen in Loch Gwir or on Knock Aine. She married Lord Desmond after he had captured her, the usual fairy bride incident, and bore him a son. Both she and the son left him, but appeared from time to time afterward, the son becoming Earl of Desmond in due course. Once he spoke to his mother about the barrenness of the hill, and next morning it was planted with peas set by her at night, a significant hint of her functions. Remnants of the agricultural ritual survived into last century in the form of a procession round the hill of St. John's Eve with clares, bunches of straw tied on poles and lit, these being afterward carried through fields and cattle to bring luck to both. One year this was neglected, but a mysterious procession with clares, headed by Aine, was seen on the hill. On another occasion, girls who had remained after the usual procession had gone met Aine, who thanked them for the honour done to her, but begged them to depart, as they wanted the hill to themselves, they being Aine's retinue, seen by the girls through a ring which she produced. Aine was thus obviously associated with fertility rites. It now remains to be seen how, according to the annalistic account, after the defeat and retirement to the hollow hills or Sid, the gods divided these among themselves, while at the same time one of their number acted as king. Chapter 3. The Division of the Sid. Celtic deities may have been associated in pagan times with hills and prehistoric tumuli, especially those near the Boyne, and within these was the subterranean land of the gods, who also dwelt on distant islands. If this were the case, it would help to explain why mounds were regarded as the retreats of the Tuatha De Danann, and why they are still supposed to emerge thence as a kind of fairies. If the folk believed that the old gods had always been associated with mounds, it was easy for the euhemeristic writers to evolve a legend of their having retired there after being defeated by the Milesians. Within these hills and mounds were their gorgeous palaces, replete with all Elysian joys. These hollow hills were known as Sid, a word possibly cognate with Latin sedes, and hence perhaps meaning seats of the gods, and their divine inhabitants were the Aes Sede, Fir Sede, Na Sede, the people or men or women of the Sid, or simply the Sede. These are everywhere regarded as the Tuatha De Danann or their descendants. Men used to worship the Sede, says Saint Fiac's hymn, while the daughters of King Leguer regarded Saint Patrick and his white-robed bishops as Aes Sede, appearing on earth. In later times, the Sede were held to be fairies and were called by various names, but these fairies closely resemble the earlier Sede, the Tuatha De Danann, while they are not necessarily of small stature. In this, they are very like the phase of medieval French belief, romantic survivals of earlier goddesses. In some stories, the Sede are associated with both with the Cid and with the island Elysium, these being regarded as synonymous. The goddess with whom Conla elopes is of the Aes Sede, yet she comes from the island overseas. The confusion may be due to the fact that the gods were supposed to have various dwelling places, not necessarily to the priority of one belief over the other. On the other hand, the Meskaulad, or intoxication of the Ulstermen, says that after their defeat, the Tuatha De Danann went underground to speak with the Sidhe. Although this may be only the confused notion of an analyst who knew of the Sidhe, yet regarded the Tuatha De Danann as human. The mingled romantico-analytic view was that the Tuatha De Danann retired to the Cid. An earlier text, The Conquest of the Cid, tells how Dagda apportioned the Cid among them, his son Oengus, who was absent, being omitted. This story is clearly based upon an earlier myth which narrates how the chief god divided their various spheres among the divinities, as the Babylonian Marduk prepared the mansions of the deities and made them inhabit these as their strongholds. Of Dagda's Cid, another document says, "Behold the Cid before your eyes. It is manifest to you that it is a king's mansion, which was built by the firm Dagda. It was a wonder, a court, an admirable hill." This was the Brug na Boin. Oengus Mac Ind Ok, or son of the young ones, that is, Dagda and Boan, was then with his foster father Midir, but soon claimed his abode as Iaso, did his blessing. The claim, however, could not be granted, whereupon Oengus asked to spend the night in Dagda's palace, to which his father agreed, granting him also the next day. When this had been elapsed, Oengus was bidden to go, but refused, because, time being composed of day and night, his tenancy must be perpetual. Thus Dagda was dispossessed, and the Cid, passing to Oengus, took his name, Brug Mac Ind Ok. In another version of this story from the Book of Fermoy, influenced by the view that some of the Tuatha De Danann had died as mortals, Dagda had long since passed away, and the mounds are places of sepulture, perhaps a reflection of the fact that kings were interred here. Yet they are apportioned by the chief survivors, Bod Dearg and Manannan, the latter having the task of selecting concealed dwellings. These he found in beautiful hills and valleys, and drew round them an invisible and impenetrable wall, though the Tuatha De Danann themselves could see and pass through it. He gave them Goibniu's ale, which preserved them from old age, disease, and death, and his own swine, which, killed and eaten one day, were alive the next and fit again for use. Thus, even from this euhemeristic narrative, the real divinity of its personages appears. In this account, Bod Dearg is made sovereign of the Tuatha De Danann, and he is also in the story of the children of Ler. Ler, disgusted at the choice, retired, whereupon the others resolved to punish him, but were overruled by Bod, who gave Ler his daughter Aub as wife, provided he would pay allegiance to him. Aub bore him 2 daughters and 2 sons before her death, and to comfort him, Bod now gave him her sister, Eowif, who, jealous of her stepchildren, transformed them into swans, a shape which they must keep for 900 years, though they retained speech and reason and the power of exquisite song. As a punishment, Bod changed Eoife into a demon of the air. Not till the time of Saint Patrick and Saint Moshamhog did Lair's children resume their own form. Withered and old, they now accepted the Christian faith and died, after having found their father's palace a roofless ruin. In the version given in the Book of Fermoy, Elkmar, foster father of Oengus, received the Brug na Boin, and Manannan advised Oengus to ask it from him. Through Manannan's magic power, Elkmar was expelled, and Oengus gained the Cid. which he dwells invisibly, eating the swine and drinking the ale of immortality. In still another version, a curious account of the origin of Oengus is given. He was a natural son of Dagda, by Elkmar's wife. Dagda sent Elkmar on a journey and wrought spells, bringing darkness and strayings upon him, and warding off hunger and thirst from him. He obtained access to the goddess, perhaps because, like Uther and Manannan on like occasions, he assumed the appearance of the real husband. Elkmar was still absent when Oengus was born, but he may later have discovered the truth, for Oengus was taunted, as Merlin was, for having no parents. He went in tears to the god Midir, who took him to Dagda, and the latter acknowledged him as his son, bidding him go to Elkmar's Cid and threaten him with death if he would not promise him the sovereignty of a day and night in his land. The same trick which Oengus played on Dagda in the first version. This story is introductory to the beautiful myth of Etain, to be told later. But here it should be noted that in a poem by the euhemerizing monk Flan Manistrech, Elkmar slew Midir and was himself slain by Oengus. This, however, need be no part of an earlier myth. Still another account is given in verse by the 10th century poet Synead Ua Arthacane. Boan, Nechtain's wife, came to stay with her brother Elkmar, vassal of Dagda, who sought her love in vain. His druids advised him to send Elkmar on a mission, but the latter bargained that it should not keep him away overnight, whereupon Dagda kept the sun in the lofty ridge of the heavens till the end of 9 months. Elkmar thought that only a day had passed, but on his return he saw by the change in the flowers how long the time had been. Meanwhile, Dagda and Boan had deceived him, but now they were afraid, and birth pang seized the faithless wife. They left her child Oengus by the roadside near Midir's Cid, and there he was brought up with his companions jeered at his unknown origin. Taxed by Oengus, Midir told the truth, and taking him to Dagda's Cid, obtained it for him for a day and night, thus tricking him. Whether the earlier story told of Dagda's or of Elkmar's dispossession, Oengus is a god who tricks his father or his foster father, and perhaps the latter was the sufferer in the primitive form. Riz makes Dagda an equivalent of Kronos and Oengus of Zeus, but apart from the disinheriting incident, which is not exactly parallel in the respective Greek and Celtic stories, Dagda and Oengus have no clear traits in common with Kronos and Zeus, nor is there the slightest evidence that Dagda, like Kronos, ruled over the dead, either before or after his expulsion. The possible basis of the story, as the present writer has suggested elsewhere, is a myth explaining why the cult of one god came to supersede that of another. Chapter 4. Mythic Powers of the Gods. As in most mythologies, the Celtic deities have powers which reflect those supposed to be possessed by medicine men, as well as others peculiar to themselves. These were the subject of myths taught by the Druids, who knew many things concerning the might of the immortal gods. The gods were undying, and their abode was that of the ever-living ones, where none ever died. Cowilde describes the Tuatha De Danann to Saint Patrick as beings who are unfading and whose duration is perennial, in contrast with himself or men. Or they are fairies or sprites with corporeal forms, endowed with immortality. Yet immortality is said to have been given them by Manannan through their drinking Goibniu's immortal beer, so that, No disease nor sickness ever attacks them, nor decay nor old age comes upon them. The daughter of Bod Deagd was asked by Saint Patrick what it was which maintained the gods in form and comeliness, and her answer was, "All such of us as partook of Goibniu's banquet, nor pain nor sickness troubles them." Elsewhere, this immortality seems to be dependent upon the eating of certain fragrant berries, of which it is said that no disease attacks those who eat them, but they feel the exhilaration of wine and old mead, and were it at the age of a century, they would return again to be 30 years old. Once the Tuatha De Danann had played a match with the Fain and brought from the land of promise crimson nuts, catkin apples, and these fragrant berries. But one of them fell to earth, and from it grew a quicken or rowan tree, whose berries possessed these virtues. The gods sent one of their people to guard the tree, a savage one-eyed giant, Sirbhan Loch-Nanach, who could not be slain until struck with 3 blows of his iron club. And around the tree he made a wilderness, sleeping in it by night and watching at its foot by day. Fionn demanded as Eric of Fine from 2 warriors either the head of Diarmaid or a handful of these berries. But Diarmaid overcame them, and then asked the giant for the berries. Siarban refused them, but by skill and strength the hero seized his club and slew him. Yet, even in their own immortal land, gods are slain. Perhaps this was not altogether the result of the analytic view of the gods, for myth may have told of their death, as it did of gods elsewhere: Dionysus, Attis, Balder, Osiris. The analytic view did not hinder the continuance of myths, and divinities whose death is recorded in the annals are found to be alive long after, while gods and goddesses born in pagan times appear thousands of years later to persons living in the Christian period. In spite of this perennial duration, they remained youthful and beautiful. Yet, while the gods' land was pictured as a deathless, peaceful place, men still gave it certain of the traits of human life. War, wounds, and death were there, according to some stories. Gods might even be slain by men, and as gods have human passions, so they may also have human weaknesses. Such is always the inconsistency of myth. Invisibility was another divine power, innate or acquired by donning a mantle, or from Manannan's spell, Faith Fiada, which was known also to druids, poets, and Christian saints, who by it became unseen or took other forms. When the sons of Midir, assisted by the Fain, fought against Bod, Midir's son and Ceuilte went to the Cid of Oengus for a physician to heal Oscar's wounds. And then there arose a Feth Fiada around us, so that we were invisible. In one passage, Dagda is invisible, and Midir said, "We behold and are not beheld." When Manannan came to fetch his consort Fand, none saw him but the goddess, and when Lug arrived to assist Cuchulainn, he was unseen by the hero's foes. Divinity sometimes hid in a magic mist, as the Tuatha De Danann did on arriving in Ireland. They could appear to such mortals as they pleased, remaining unseen by others. Gods were probably not regarded as spiritual beings. Like the dead in Celtic belief, they had resplendent corporeal forms and ate and drank. But their bodily form differed from men's in that it could become invisible and was not subject to the laws of gravitation. The gods travelled through the air or appeared above men's heads. How then did they appear when visible? Sometimes in the magnificence of divinity, yet still in anthropomorphic form. Sometimes they were of vast size, like the Morrigan or the Welsh Bran, while a goddess who sought the aid of Fionn was enormous compared even with the gigantic Fane. Sometimes they appear merely as mortals and are not recognized as gods. Instances of this are found in the story of Cuchulainn's birth, where Lugh is seen as a mortal host in a mysterious house, and in that of Merlin's father, invisible to all but his mother, and later taking human shape. Sometimes a disguise was assumed. Oengus and Midir appeared to Rib and Eochaid in the shape of Hospitalis, with a haltered pack horse, and bade them begone. Gods also took the appearance of particular mortals, as when Midir appeared to Etain as a lover Alilil, or Manannan as Fiachna to the latter's wife, or as when Puil and Arawan exchanged forms. Animal forms were also assumed. Of these, one favorite shape was that of birds. Morrigan appeared to Cuchulainn as a bird, and also to Devorgilla and her handmaid, the former being in love with the hero. Lugh took the form of an eagle, Bude and his foster brother that of birds when the former wished to visit his paramour, whose husband Nar slew them. Midir and Etain, Fand and Liban were seen as birds linked together. The gods, or Sidhe, appear as deer in one story. Again, the idea of divine shape-shifting, expressed, however, in the well-known folk-tale formula of the transformation combat, is combined with the Celtic idea of rebirth in Welsh and Irish tales. And the Welsh story, Hanes Taliesin, a 16th century tale, is based on earlier poems in which this formula is already prefixed to the rebirth incident. Shape-shifting is so commonly ascribed to Taliesin that it is no wonder that the formula was attached to his story, as it also was to the Greek myth of Proteus and the Hindu story of Vikramaditya. In the poem, Taliesin describes his transformation and adds, "I have been a grain discovered, which grew on a hill. A hen received me with ruddy claws and parting comb. I rested 9 nights in her womb a child." The Hanes Taliesin represents earlier myths about the hero and Seri Dwen, the latter being a Brythonic goddess. Seri Dwen, who dwelt below a lake, became hostile to Gwion back because he obtained the inspiration which she had intended for her son. The goddess pursued him, but he changed himself to a hare, and she took the form of a greyhound, after which the pair successively became fish and otter, bird and hawk, grain of wheat and hen. Ceridwen as a hen swallowed the grain, and gave birth to a beautiful child, whom she cast into the sea, but he was rescued by Elphin and obtained the name of Taliesin. In most versions of the transformation combat, the opponents are males, and therefore one cannot give birth to the other. But by an ingenious device, the compiler of the Irish myth of the 2 swineherds, an introductory story to the Tain Bo Culange, surmounted this difficulty. The swineherds were subordinate divinities: Friuch, herd of the god Bob, king of the Cid of Munster, and Rucht, herd of Ochal Oichni, king of the Cid of Connaught. They could take any shape, and there was friendship between them. When there was mast in Munster, Rucht fed his swine there, and Friuch brought his herd to Connaught in the same way. People stirred up a quarrel between them, however, and Friuch put spells on Rucht's swine so that they should not eat the mast of Munster, while Rucht did the same to Friuch's pigs. When the swine became thin, the gods took their office from the herds, and Friuch and Rucht turned themselves into ravens, and for a year reviled each other in Connaught and for a year in Munster. Resuming their own shape, they announced that there would yet be many corpses and much wailing because of them. Now they took the form of water beasts and were seen for a year in the Suir and for another in the Shannon, devouring each other, and appearing as large as hills, until they came ashore as men, telling Ochal that they must still take other shapes to test their strength. They became champions, one of Bod's host, the other of Fergna, king of the Cid of Nento for Huskne, their term in this form ending with a fight which lasted 3 days and nights, and in which they gave such wounds that their lungs were visible. Next they became demons, a third of the people dying with fright at seeing them, while in another version transformations into stags and dragons are added. Finally they became worms, one in a spring in Connaught, the other in the river Croynd in Ulster. Queen Med came one day to the spring to draw water, and the little animal, speckled with all colours, jumped into her dish. She spoke to it, and it told her that it had been in many shapes, and bade her take Ailill as a husband, after which it returned into the spring. That day Fiachna washed in the river Croynd, and was frightened at seeing a tiny beast which told him of the luck about to befall him, and how it was Bod's swineherd. It besought Fiachna to feed it for a year, as the other had begged of Meb, and later it told him of a future combat with the other beast. Next day, one of Fiachna's cows would swallow it when drinking, as one of Meb's kine would swallow the other, and as a result, Meb's cow bore Fin Ben Nach, or White Horn, and Fiachna's the Dawn, or Brown Bull of Cualange. No bull dared below before either, and great war was caused in Ireland on their account. The Dint Censure speaks of 7 shapes which the swineherds took, but describes 5 only: swineherds, birds, wolves, trout, and worms, and it also tells how a bull calf of the Dawns was killed by Whitehorn. A folk tale analogy to this myth occurs in a West Irish collection. 2 heroes at enmity fought until they were old men, then as puppies until they were old dogs, then as young bulls, as stallions, and as birds, until one was slain, his body falling on the other and killing him. The rebirth incident is lacking here. In the story which narrates how King Mongan received his wife from the King of Leinster, his feats were originally those of a divine namesake. Taking the form of a cleric, he gave that of another cleric to his attendant and won entrance to the king's fort and to his wife. He kissed her, but when the attendant had cried out, he sent a magic breath at her, and what she had seen was no longer clear in her mind, after which he shaped a sharp spike on which she fell and was killed. His attempt to recover his wife failed, however, and at a later time he took the guise of Aed, son of the king of Connaught, transforming a hag into the shape of Aed's beautiful wife, Ibhel. The king of Leinster fell in love with her and exchanged Mongan's wife to the pretended Aed for her. But the pair escaped, and great was the king's disgust to find Ibhel in the form of a hag. Mongan also made a river with a bridge over it, where none had ever been before, and in it he set the 2 clerics whose shapes he had borrowed. The gods could likewise transform each other. Etain was changed by Fuamnach into an insect, as a preliminary to her rebirth, and we have seen how the children of Lair were transformed into swans by their jealous stepmother. Lair heard them singing, yet god though he was, he could not disenchant them, just as Manannan was unable to change Ioife from the shape of a crane into which the jealous Euchra had turned her. The gods remained for 300 years listening to the music of the swans, which caused happiness to all who heard it. And after many sufferings, the birds met the sons of Bod, who spoke to them of the divinities, while Fiongola sang of her former happiness when she enjoyed the guideless teaching of Manannan, the convocations of Bod, the voice of Oengus, and the sweetness of his kisses. We have seen how the children, after their disenchantment, died in the Christian faith. This old and touching myth has received a Christian ending. How it originally told the further fate of Lair's children is unknown. The gods also transformed mortals. Morrigan brought a bull to a cow over which Odrus watched, and which followed the bull when Morrigan went into the cave of Cruachan. Odrus pursued through the cave to the Cid within, but there she fell asleep, and the goddess awoke her, sang spells over her, and made of her a pool of water. This is partly paralleled by another story in which elves, or Siabra, transformed Aege into a fawn and sent her round Ireland. Later she was killed, and nothing remained of her but a bag of water which was thrown into a river, thenceforward named after her. A more curious transformation is that by which the god Oengus changed his 4 kisses into as many birds, in order that they might satirize the nobles of Erin, until a druid by a stratagem stopped them. As has been seen, the kisses of Oengus were dear to Financola. The souls of the righteous appear sometimes as white birds, and those of the wicked as ravens, in Christian documents, a conception which is probably of pagan origin. Finally, to show how the memory of the Tuatha De Danann and their powers survived into later centuries, the story of O'Donnell's cairn may be cited. In this, Manannan appears as a cairn, or serving man, at the houses of historic personages of 16th century Ireland. He plays such music as never was heard, bewitching men to slumber. He is a marvellous conjurer, producing out of his baghound, hare, dog boy, and lady, who all climb a silken thread which he tosses upward to a cloud. He performs miracles of healing. He takes off a man's head and puts it on again, and from each place where he goes, he suddenly disappears from human sight, none knowing whither he has vanished. Folk memory thus preserved much of the old conception of the gods. Chapter 5. Gods helping mortals. In Greek mythology, the gods were represented as coming to man's help, and in Christian legend, saints were seen hovering above an army in battle and giving it substantial aid. So, in Celtic myth, deities were often kindly disposed towards men or assisted them, sometimes for ends of their own. Such a myth is associated with the historic King Mongan of Ulster in the 6th and 7th centuries. He is shown to be son of the god Manannan by a mortal mother, and, as has been seen, he had powers of shape-shifting, and besides being brought up in the divine land, had free access to it. He was also regarded as a rebirth of the hero Fionn. Hence the stories told of this king of the Christian historic period must already have been narrated of some far earlier mythic king or god, perhaps possessed of the same name. 2 of these legends narrate how the god assisted Mongan's putative father out of desire for his wife. In the shorter story, Fiachna, king of Ulster, had gone to help Aidan in Scotland against Saxon hosts who had with them a terrible warrior. And during the fight, a noble stranger appeared to Fiachna's wife and asked her love. She refused him with scorn, but later relented in order to save her husband's life, which, said the visitant, was in danger from the terrible warrior. Our son will be famous, and his name will be Mongan. I shall tell thy husband our adventures, and that thou didst send me to this help." This the stranger did, afterward slaying the warrior and giving victory to Fiachna. And when Mongan was born, he was known as Manannan's son, for Manannan had announced his name when leaving the queen at dawn. In the longer version, Fiachna had become security for the exchange of 4 kine offered by the king of Lochlan to a black hag for her cow, the flesh of which alone could cure his disease. Later the hag compelled Fiachna to fight with the king, who had broken his promise to her. But all went well until the king of Lochlan let loose venomous sheep, before which Fiachna's men fell in hundreds. A warrior in a green cloak fastened by a silver brooch, with a circlet of gold on his head and golden sandals on his feet, appeared and asked what reward Fiachna would give him, who would drive off the sheep. Fiachna replied that he would give anything he had, whereupon the warrior begged his ring, as a token for me when I go to Ireland to thy wife, to sleep with her. To which the complacent Fiachna assented. The stranger, Manannan, announced that he would beget a glorious child, called Mongan Finn, or the Fair. And I shall go there in thy shape, so that thy wife shall not be defiled by it. Fiachna would also become king of Lochlan. Taking a venomous hound from his cloak, Manannan launched it successfully at the sheep, and then appeared to the queen as Fiachna. On the night of Mongan's birth, the queen's attendant had a son, Mac an Daim, while the wife of Fiachna's opponent, Fiachna the Black, bore a daughter, Dub Lacha, these possibly also being children of the amorous god. When Mongan was 3 days old, Manannan took him to the land of promise and brought him back when he was 16. Meanwhile, Fiachna Dub having killed the other Fiachna, the Ulstermen bargained that Mongan should retain half the province, with Dub Lacha as his wife. One day when he and his queen were playing together, a dark, black-tufted little cleric reproached Mongan for his inactivity and offered to help him to regain his land. Mongan went with him. They slew Fiachna, and all Ulster became Mongans. The cleric was Manannan, though his transformation, in this as in the other version, is the result of the revision of the story by a Christian scribe. At a later time, Mongan exchanged Dub Lacha for the kine of the king of Leinster, but she, while living in the king's house, persuaded him to wait a year ere she was his. How Mongan regained her through his magic powers learned in the divine land has already been described. A prophecy about Mongan is put into Manannan's mouth in the Voyage of Bran, where he tells Bran how he will go to Fiachna's queen, that by her he will have a son who will delight the folk of the Cid, will make known secrets and take all forms, dragon, wolf, stag, salmon, seal, and how the god will place the valiant hero with princes and will be his tutor. Apart from the Christian colouring in these tales, they are of pagan origin and reflect pagan ideas about semi-divine sons of gods and the help given by gods to men. The late Mr. Nutt maintained that the story of Mongan was one form of a Celtic myth which might be fitted to any real or imaginary hero, that of a wonder child, born of a mortal mother and a supernatural father, gifted magically by him, associated with him in the divine land, and passing thence at death. He assumed that Mongan had finally gone there, basing his assumption on verses which mention Mongan's wandering with Manannan in the land with living heart, and his coming thence to see Saint Columba. Mongan was the hero of such a myth in Ulster, Fionn of another local myth, later popular all over Ireland, author of a similar Brythonic myth. The myth of the help given by gods to mortals is seen again in the story of Cuchulainn, son of the god Lugh, who assists him in time of need. Cuchulainn stood alone against Medb's hosts, because she invaded Ulster when its men were in their periodic sickness. He had slain hundreds of them, and was now distorted with fury and in sore distress, when Loeg, his charioteer, announced that he saw a warrior approaching, fair, tall, with yellow hair, clad in a green mantle with a silver brooch. Shield, five-pointed spear, and javelin were in his hands. He plied these as he came, but no one attacks him, and he attacks no one, for he was invisible to Medb's warriors. Cuchulainn cried that this must be one of his friends of the Sidhe coming to his aid, and so it turned out, for the warrior was his father Lugh from the Sid. "My wounds are heavy," said Cuchulainn. "It is time they were healed." Lugh bade him sleep for 3 days while he himself fought the hosts, and as he sang a charm, the hero slept. Lugh not only battled for him, but as he had claimed the power of healing in the story of the Battle of Macturid, so now he cured his son's wounds with medicinal herbs. And when Cuchulainn awoke, he was refreshed and strong. The god, however, would not stay to help him further, lest the fame of the deeds wrought by both should accrue to Cuchulainn. And the hero now donned a dress of invisibility given him by Manannan, a precious garment of the land of promise. Manannan is also called his foster father in Druidism or wizardry, and Cuchulainn's friends of the Sidhe may be compared with the Lianan Sighe, or fairies who befriend mortals when human powers fail them. His opponent, Ferdia, reproached him for not telling him how his friends of the Sidhe came to his aid when he thought of them. But Cuchulainn replied that since the Feth Fidda was shown to all by the sons of Mael, the Tuatha De Danann could not use invisibility or work magic. This passage, however, from the Stow manuscript of the Tain Bo Cualange is, in its final statement, inconsistent with the incidents of the other manuscripts. Other heroes were helped by Manannan. In The Tragic Death of the Sons of Usnech, Naisi has a sword given to him by the god, its virtue being that it leaves no trace of stroke or blow behind it. And some of his weapons were possessed by the Fane. Diarmaid had his Cran Buidhe, a yellow-shafted spear, but its properties were less powerful than another magic spear with a red shaft, the Gai Diarg. It could do nothing against the boar which slew Diarmaid, and he lamented that he had not taken with him the Gai Diarg, as Graine advised. With the shafts of these spears, he twice leaped beyond the ring of his surrounding enemies and escaped them. And he also used Manannan's magic staves on another occasion to leap up a precipice. Besides these, he possessed the Moral Touch, the sword of Manannan or of Oengus. Of Diarmaid it is said that, with most potent Manannan, Mac Ler thou studiest and was brought up in the land of promise and in the day-intended coasts. With Oengus too, the Dagda's son, thou wast most accurately taught. Oengus freely helped Diarmaid when he and Grain were pursued by Fionn. Oengus learned that they were surrounded in a wood, and passing through the foe, unknown to the Fane, he bade the eloping pair come under his mantle, when he would remove them without the pursuer's knowledge. Diarmaid refused to go, but asked the god to take Graine, which Oengus did, reaching a distant wood unseen. There Diarmaid came to them and found a fire and a meal prepared by Oengus, where he left to them warned Diarmaid of the places into which he must not go. When Diarmaid and Graine took refuge in the quicken tree of Dubros, Oengus came invisibly as before. But now, as each warrior in succession climbed the tree to take Diarmaid's head, he gave them the hero's form as he threw them down. When the Fane cut the heads off, however, their true form was restored, and the ruse was discovered. Oengus would fain have carried both away, but again had to be satisfied with taking Graine, bearing her invisibly in his magic cloak to the Brug na Boyne, where Diarmaid joined them, carrying the head of the witch whom Fionn had sent against him. Oengus now made peace between Diarmaid and Fionn, arranging the conditions which his foster son demanded. Finally, when Diarmaid's death was caused by Fionn's craft, the latter advised that he and the others should escape lest Oengus and the Tuatha De Danann should capture them. Oengus, aware of the tragedy, arrived with the swiftness of the wind, and seeing the body, cried, "There has never been one night, since I took thee with me to the Brug na Boyne, at the age of 9 months, that I did not watch thee and carefully keep thee against thy foes, until last night, O Diarmaid. And alas for the treachery that Fionn hath done thee, for all that thou wast at peace with him." Then he sang a lament, and bearing the body to his brug, he said, "Since I cannot restore him to life, I will send a soul into him, so that he may talk to me each day." Oengus has less power than savage medicine men or gods in myth, who bring the dead back to life, or than Demeter, who gave life to Dionysos after he was dismembered by the Titans. But the story is an almost unparalleled example of a god's love for a mortal. Fionn himself bears witness to the love which Oengus had for Diarmaid as a child in his brug, and how, when spells were put upon a boar that it should have the same length of life as he, the god conjured him never to hunt a boar. Another interesting instance is found in the story of Frauch, whose mother was a goddess. When he killed a dragon, women of the Cid came and carried him there, curing him of his wounds. And so too, when he was slain at a ford by Cuchulainn, those divine women, clad in green, came and lamented over him and carried his body into the Cid. Frauch should not have gone near water, for this was dangerous for him, and his mother's sister, the goddess Boan, had said, "Let him not swim black water, for in it he will shed his blood." In another story, the goddess Morrigan helped Tulchainde, Conair's druid, who wished Dil, daughter of Lugmanner, to elope with him from the Isle of Falga, the Isle of Man regarded as the divine land. Dil loved an ox-born at the same time as herself, and insisted that Tulchainde should take it with her. And the Morrigan was friendly to him, and at his wish brought it to Magamburg. The Morrigan was both hostile and friendly to Cuchulainn, thus resembling that supernatural but ambiguous personage, the Lady of the Lake in Arthurian tradition, now helping, now opposing. Chapter 6. Divine Enmity and Punishment. The gods were sometimes hostile to men, not always for obvious reasons, as is curiously illustrated in the Echtra Nerai, or Adventures of Nera, an introductory tale to the Tain Bo Kualunge. Here the gods are regarded as demons appearing with great power on Samhain Eve, Halloween. King Ailil offered a reward to anyone who on that night would tie a withe round the foot of a captive hanged the previous day. And several tried, but were afraid. Nera was bolder, but his withe kept springing off the corpse until it told him to put a peg in it, after which the dead body asked him to carry it on his back to the nearest house for a drink, because I was thirsty when I was hanged. The house was surrounded by a fiery lake, and into it and a second, surrounded by a lake of water, they could not enter. In a third house the corpse found water and squirted it on the faces of the sleepers so that they died, after which Nera carried the dead body to the gallows. This part of the story is connected with the vampire belief. Nera returned to Ailil's fort, but found it burnt, and a heap of human heads lay near it. He followed a company leaving it, and thus came to the Cid of Cruachan, where its king sent him to a woman in one of its dwellings, bidding him bring firewood daily to the royal house. At this task he noticed a lame man carrying a blind man to a well, and daily the blind man asked, "Is it there?" To which the lame man answered, "It is indeed. Let us go away." The woman told Nera that they were guardians of the king's crown in the well, and when he described his adventures and the destruction of Ailil's fort, she explained that this was merely the glamour of an elfin host, Sluag Siabra, but that it would happen unless he warned his friends. When he returned, he would find them as he left them, a clear proof that he was in a timeless region. They must watch next Samhain Eve, unless they first destroyed the Cid, and as proof of his statement he must take from the Cid fruits of summer, wild garlic, primrose, and golden fern. Before his people came to destroy the Cid, he must warn her so that she with his cattle and the child she would bear him might not lose their lives. Nera returned and obtained the reward, and Ailil resolved to destroy the Cid. Meanwhile the woman carried the firewood, pretending that Nera was ill, and when he came to warn her, she bade him watch the cattle, one of which was to be his son's after his birth. The goddess Morrigan stole this cow while Nera slept and took it to the bull of Qualunge, by whom it had a calf. Cuchulainn is now introduced pursuing Morrigan and restoring the cow, and on its return the woman sent Nera back to his people, a reduplication of the first sending back. The Cid folk could not destroy Ailil's fort until next Samhain Eve, when the Cid would be open, and Nera now told his people of the wonderful Cid and how its dwellers were coming to attack the fort. Ailil bade him bring anything of his own out of the Cid, and from it he fetched the cattle, including his child's bull calf, which now fought the famous Find Benach, or white-horned bull. Warned to beware of its sire, the bull of Qualunge, Medb swore by her gods that she would not rest until her bull fought it. Meanwhile, Ailil's men destroyed the Cid, taking from it the crown, Leogair's mantle, and Dunlaing's shirt. But Nera was left in the Cid, and will not come thence till doom. Like other mortals, he has become an inhabitant of the gods' land. Here also, as in the story of Etain, mortals wage successful war with hostile divinities. Nevertheless, the deities survive, and only the outer works of their Cid are destroyed. The hostility of Morrigan to the hero Cuchulainn is seen in the Tyne Bow Regamna, or Cattle Raid of Regamon. In his sleep he heard a great cry, and setting off with his charioteer, Loic, to discover its meaning, they came to a chariot drawn by a one-legged horse, the chariot pole passing through his body and emerging from its head. On it was a red woman, clad in red, and near it marched the giant in a red tunic, carrying a spear and a huge forked branch, and driving a cow. Cuchulainn maintained that all the cows in Ulster were his, but the woman denied this, and when he asked why she spoke for the man, she announced that his name was Uargaith Seko Luacher Seko. Then the giant cried out that her name was Faibor Beg Beoil, Quim Duid Fault Sent Bagrit Skeo Uath. Irritated at this gibberish, an instance of the well-known concealment of divine names, the hero leaped into the chariot, placing his feet on the woman's shoulders and his spear at her head, and demanded her true name, to which she replied that she was a sorceress, and that the cow was her reward for a poem. Cuchulainn begged to hear it, and the woman consented, provided that he would retire from the chariot. After the poem was recited, Cuchulainn prepared to leap again into the chariot, when woman, giant, cow, and chariot vanished. But on the branch of a tree was a black bird. The woman changed to this form. Now he recognized her as Bad, or the Morrigan, the battle goddess, and she told him that for his conduct she would pursue him with vengeance. She was carrying the cow from the Sed of Cruachan, that it might be covered by the bull of Coalange, and when their calf was a year old, Cuchulainn would die. She would attack him when facing his opponent at the ford during the foray of Coalange, and as an eel she would twine round his feet. I will crush thee against the stones of the ford, and thou wilt never obtain healing from me, answered Cuchulainn. As a she-wolf I will bite thy right hand and devour thee, she replied. I shall strike thee with my lance and put out an eye, and never wilt thou obtain healing from me, he returned. As a white cow with red ears I will enter the water, followed by 100 cows. We shall dash upon thee. Thou wilt fall, and thy head will be taken. I shall throw a sling stone at thee, and thy heel shall be broken, and no help wilt thou get from me, cried Cuchulainn. And with that Morrigan disappeared into the Sed of Cruachan. In a variant of this tale, where the cow-driving incident is perhaps the one which is mentioned in the Ectra Nerai, a different reason for this hostility is given. Morrigan appeared as a beautiful woman offering Cuchulainn her love, her treasures, and her herds, but he replied that the opportunity was not fitting, since he was engaged in a desperate contest, and contemptuously refused her help. She uttered threats as in the previous version, and when he was fighting at the ford, he was overturned by an eel which he crushed in his hand, and again as a wolf and a heifer Morrigan was defeated. Now no one wounded by Cuchulainn could be healed save by himself, and Morrigan therefore appeared as a lame and blind old woman milking a cow with 3 teats. Cuchulainn asked for milk, which she gave him from each tit, and at every draught he pronounced the blessing of gods and not gods upon her. At each benediction one of her wounds was healed, and now she revealed herself, but was told that, had he known, she would never have had healing from him. Perhaps because of this healing, or because of a subsequent reconcilement, before Cuchulainn went to the last fatal fight, the goddess broke his chariot, for she liked not his going to the battle, knowing that he would not come again to Emain Macha. The story also shows how divinities have the gift of shape-shifting, though it does not always avail them against the prowess of a hero. The idea that gods punish neglect of their worship or commands, or avenge other sinful actions, is found in most religions, and some stories seem to be derived from it, as when Welsh legend knows of Ninnu Yao and Peibol transformed to oxen for their sins by God, a probable substitution for a pagan divinity. Instances of the destruction of corn and milk by divinities have been cited, and these perhaps signify punishment for neglecting the gods, saying that, in the case of the Milesians with Dagda, this was followed by a compact made with him, the equivalent of the fresh covenant made with God by his careless worshippers in the Old Testament. Possibly stories like that of Eilen Mac Midna of the Tuatha De Danann, coming out of the Cid every year to burn Tara, point to the same conception. The gods even punished members of their own group for wrongdoing, as in the case of Ioife, who was transformed by Bod. And Becuma was banished from the god's land because of her sin with Manannan's son. She came to earth in a self-moving boat and by spells bound Conn, High King of Ireland, to do her will and to banish his son Art. But while she remained in dalliance with Conn for a year, there was neither corn nor milk in Ireland. A direct divine punishment, for it was held that an evil king's reign was marked by famine and destruction. The Druids told Conn that nothing would avail save the sacrifice of the son of a sinless couple, that is, the son of the queen of a divine land, whom Conn brought thence. To rescue the boy, his mother came with a marvelous cow, which was accepted as a sacrifice, while the queen told Conn that he must renounce Becuma, else Ireland would lose a third of its corn and milk. Later, when the Cid folk stole the chessmen with which Becuma was playing with Art, she put spells on him not to eat until he had brought Delbchaim from a mysterious island, intending thus to cause his death. He sailed till he reached an Elysian island, whose fair women taught him how to escape the dangers before him and to find Delbchaim. But when he brought her to Tara, Becuma in disgust left Conn forever. Punishment of a divine being is also seen in the story of Manannan slaying Ferfedel because of his misdeed, which resulted in the drowning of Tuag. Conchian slew Dagda's son Aed for seducing his wife, and though Dagda did not kill him, he made him carry the corpse until he found a stone as long as Aed to put upon his grave. Trespass on a sacred place is implied in the story of Eochaid, who eloped with his stepmother. Oengus, in disguise, told him not to camp on his meadow, and when he persisted, the god sent plagues upon him, killing his cattle and horses, and threatening to slay his household if he would not go. Oengus then gave him a horse on which to depart with his goods, and the lake which was formed afterward from the bursting of an uncovered well produced by the micturation of this horse drowned Eochaid and all his household, save his daughter Liban. This, as well as the similar story told of Eochaid's brother Rib, who trespassed on the ground of Oengus and Midir, had affinity with tales of the bursting of a sacred well upon the impious trespasser, as in the legend of Boan. In another story, Oilil pastured his cattle on the exterior of a Cid, the grass of which the Cid folk now destroyed. While Oilil watched there with Ferches, he saw fairy cattle leaving the Cid, followed by Eogabal, son of its king, and his daughter Aine. Eogabal was slain by Ferches, and Aine was outraged by Oilil, but she struck his right ear, leaving no flesh on it, whence his epithet, bare ear. Aine promised vengeance, which was brought thus. Eogan, Oilil's son, and Lugaid mac Con heard music proceeding from a yew formed by magic as part of the means employed for vengeance, and in it was found a little harper, who was brought by them to Oilil. Before he went away, however, he made contention between Eogan and Lugaid. The latter was slain, and this caused the battle of Meg Mucraim, where Oilil's 7 sons perished. In this story, gods are within men's power, though the latter cannot finally escape punishment. So also is it in the tale of Macha, son of women folk, daughter of Midir, or of Sain Red, son of Ler, who came to the house of the rich peasant Cronchu and served him, bringing him prosperity and living with him as his wife. Cronchu went to a feast of the Ulstermen, but was bidden by Macha not to say an impudent word or mention her name. At the horse racing, however, he boasted that his wife was swifter than the horses, whereupon King Conchoba insisted that she should be sent for, and though she was with child, forced her to run against his chariot. She said that all who saw it would suffer for the deed, and when at the goal she gave birth to twins, she condemned every Ulsterman to undergo for 5 days and 4 nights each year all the pangs which she had felt, and to have no strength during that time. Cuchulainn alone escaped that curse. The automatic working out of punishment is seen in the tragic results of the breaking of personal taboos. Example, in the case of Cuchulainn and Fionn. This is sometimes regarded as the inevitable operation of fate or as divine vengeance for wrong done to gods, not necessarily by the victim, and it receives its most mysterious illustration in the doom of Conaire Mór in the long tale of Da Derga's Hostel. In some versions, Conaire's origin is connected with incest, itself caused by a vengeful god, while his death at the height of his prosperity is regarded as the consequence of injury done by his ancestor to the god Midir, whose wife Etain was retaken from him by Conaire's forefather, Eochaid. Through a trick of Midir's, Eochaid has a child, Mes Buachalla, by his daughter Es, and Mes Buachalla was mother of Conaire. Who then was Conaire's father? One account regards him as King Etherskel, while Mes Buachalla is here daughter of Es and one of the Side, or of Es and Etherskel, the latter version thus introducing the incest incident in another form. Another account tells how Eochaid married Etain, daughter of Itar, king of the cavalcade from the Cid. And their daughter Etain became Cormac's wife, but was put away because she bore him no son. Cormac ordered his infant daughter to be slain, but she smiled so sweetly on his thralls that they took her to King Etherskel's cowherds, who guarded her in a hut with a high roof, whence her name Mes Buachalla, or the cowherd's foster child. Through the roof light, Etherskel's people saw her when she was grown up, and told the king of her beauty. Now it was prophesied that he would have a son by a woman of unknown race, but before he sent for her, a bird flew through the roof light, and doffing its plumage, became a man, to whom Mes Buachalla yielded herself. Before leaving her, he told how she would have a son, Conaire, by him, who must never hunt birds. And Conaire was regarded as Etherskel's child when born. At Etherskel's death, the new king was to be selected by divination at the bull feast. A bull was killed, probably as a sacrifice, and after the diviner had eaten its flesh, he dreamed of the future king, in this case, a naked man with a sling coming to Tara. Meanwhile, Conaire hunted a flock of wonderful birds, which suddenly became armed men, one of them telling him that he was Nemglan, king of the birds, his father, and that he was breaking his gyasa, or taboos, in hunting his kinsmen. Conaire replied that he knew nothing of this case, whereupon Nemglan bade him go naked toward Tara, where watchers would meet him. In this incident there is doubtless some dim memory of clan totem myths. A different account of his becoming king makes Mes Buachalla tell him for the first time who his father is, that is, Eterskel, her own father, when he had just died. His successor must fulfill certain apparently impossible conditions, but Conaire met the terms and became king. Mysterious hosts brought to him by his mother stayed with him for a time and then departed, none knew whither. They were Sidde from Bri Leith, Midir Sid. This appears to mean that Conaire was divinely assisted to become king, so that the approaching disaster might be all the greater. To return to the other account, Nemglan told Conaire the gyasa which he must observe. He became king, and none ever had a more prosperous reign. Plenty abounded, and murder and rapine were banished. At last, however, the vengeance of the god began to work. Through a fate which he could not resist, Conaire one day settled a quarrel between two of his serfs, thus breaking one of the gyasa, and on his return he saw the whole country in flame and smoke, a delusion of the Sidde. To avoid the fire, he and his men went sunwise round Tara and counterclockwise round Bregia. These were tabooed directions, and as he went, he pursued the evil beasts of Serna, disobeying another taboo. Then, belated, he resolved to stay in the hostel of Derga, or Red, and 3 red-haired horsemen clad in red on red steeds were seen preceding him to the house of Red, another of his gyasa. He sent messengers after them begging them to fall behind, but they only went the faster and announced, "We ride the steeds of Don Tetskorach, or Midir's son, from the Sid. Though we are alive, we are dead. Great are the signs, destruction of life, sating of ravens, feeding of crows, strife of laughter, whetting of sword edge, shields with broken bosses in hours after sundown. Lo, my son!" With this boding prophecy, they vanished, and the gods themselves thus caused the violation of Conaire's gyasa. After arriving at the hostel, he broke yet another, for there came a hideous woman who, standing on one foot, holding up one hand, and casting an evil eye on Conaire and his men, foretold their doom. Then she begged to be taken in, appealing to Conaire's generosity, and he said, "Let her in, though it is a gaze of mine." At this time, Inxel, whose single eye had 3 pupils, invaded Ireland with Conaire's foster brothers, and they were now on their way to attack the hostel. Inkel is described as going toward it to spy upon the inmates, returning with ever-fresh reports of the wonders and the people seen by him, some of them gigantic and monstrous, with magic weapons. When the hostel was surrounded, a terrible battle began. Conaire was parched with thirst, but no water was to be obtained, though his ally Mac Checht sought it in all Ireland. Lakes and rivers had been dried up, apparently by the gods, as at the first battle of Mac Tuired, and one loch alone was reached before its water disappeared. Makshect returned with a draught, but all too late. Conaire's host was scattered and dead, and he himself was being decapitated by two of his foes, whom Makshect slew, and then poured the water into Conaire's mouth. The head thanked him for his act, and thus perished Conaire, through no fault of his own, victim of fate and of a god's vengeance. The story is as tragic as a Greek drama, if its art is less consummate. Chapter 7. The Loves of the Gods. Like the gods of Greece and India, the deities of the Celts had many love adventures, and the stories concerning these generally have a romantic aspect. An early tale of this class records that one night, as Oengus slept, he saw a beautiful maiden by his bedside. He would have caught hold of her, but she vanished, and until next night he was restless and ill. Again she appeared, singing and playing on a cymbal, and so it continued for a year till Oengus was sick of love. Fergne, a cunning leech, diagnosed the cause of his patient's illness and bade Boann, Oengus's mother, search all Ireland for the maiden. But though she sought during a whole year, the girl could not be found. Fergne therefore bade Boann summon Dagda, Oengus's father, and he advised him to ask the help of Bodb, king of the city of Munster, famed for knowledge. Bodb discovered the maiden, and Oengus set out to see whether he could recognize her. By the sea they found many girls, linked two and two by silver chains, and one, taller than the rest, was the maiden of the vision, Caer, daughter of Ithal of Cid Uaman. Dagda, advised by Bodb, sought help from Ailill and Medb, king and queen of Connaught, another instance of mortals aiding gods. But Ethel refused Ailill's request to give up Caer, whereupon Dagda's army, with Ailill's forces, destroyed his Cid and took him prisoner. Still he refused, because he had no power over his daughter, for every second year she and her maidens took the form of birds at Loch Bel Draccan, the lake of the dragon's mouths, and thither Dagda bade Oengus go. At this loch, says incidental reference to the story, the maidens were wont to remain all the year of their transformation, Caer as the most lovely of all birds, wearing a golden necklace, from which hung 150 chains, each with a golden ball. When Oengus saw the birds, he called to Caer. "Who calls me?" she cried. "It is Oengus that calls thee. Come to him, that he may bathe with thee." The bird maiden came, and Oengus also took the form of a bird. Together they plunged 3 times in the lake, and then flew to Brugna-Boyne, singing so sweetly that everyone fell asleep for 3 days and nights. Caer now became Oengus's wife. In this story, the god Bodb is famed for knowledge, and in the incidental reference cited, he is said for a whole year to have kept off by his magic power the harper Cleach, who sought his daughter's hand. Possibly the shape-shifting of Caer and her maidens was the result of a curse or spell, as in other instances, unless, being goddesses, the power was in their own hands. The myth uses the folk tale formula of the Swan Maiden, though its main incident is lacking, that is, her capture by obtaining the bird dress, which she had doffed. In the story of Oengus's disinheriting Elkmar, he later appears as a suitor for Etain, daughter of Ailill, who refused her to him. But Midir was more successful, whence there was enmity between him and Oengus. The long tale which follows is extant in several manuscripts and is here pieced together mainly from the versions in the Egerton manuscript and the Leibhar na ni Uidre. Besides Etain, Medea had another consort, Fuan Manch, who was jealous of her. With the help of a druid spells and by her own sorceries, she changed Etain into an insect and by a magic wind blew her about for 7 years. But Oengus found her in this state and made for her a grianan, or bower filled with shrubs and flowers, on which she fed and thrived. Perhaps by night she was able to resume her true form, for Oengus slept with her. And when Fuamnach heard of this, she caused Medea to send for Oengus, so that a reconciliation might be effected. Meanwhile, however, Fuamnach went to the Grianan and again by a magic wind ejected Etain, who was blown upon the breeze until she fell through the roof of Itair's house into his wife's golden cup. She swallowed the insect and later gave birth to the divinity as an infant called Etain, who, more than 1,000 years before, had been born as a goddess. When she now grew up, as she and her maidens were bathing, a warrior appeared, singing about Etain, and then vanished, this being Medea, or possibly Oengus, who had discovered Fuamnach's treachery and struck off her head. Here, however, is interpolated a verse telling how not Oengus but Manannan slew or burned her, as well as her grandson, Siugmal. The next section of the story exists in 2 forms and relates how Etain was married by Eochaid Aedom, king of Ireland. His brother, Ailill Angol Nach, fell in love with her, and when at last he disclosed this to Etain, she, after much persuasion, arranged a meeting place with him. At the appointed time, however, Ailill did not come, being hindered by sleep. But one in his likeness appeared to Etain on successive occasions, and at last announced himself to be Medea, who had thus dealt with Ailill, and told her how she was his consort, parted from him by magic. Nevertheless, she refused to go with him, but when she told Ailill, he was cured of his love. The Egerton version then relates how Medea, appearing in hideous form, carried off Etain and her handmaid Crochan to his Cid of Brie Laith, near the rising of the sun, first staying on the way at the Cid of his divine relative Sinech. And when Crochan complained of wasting time there, Medea said that this Cid would now bear her name. In the version given by the Leabhar Naudhire, the incident of Medea's disclosing himself is more mythical in character. He invited Etain to the god's land, the Great Plain, or Magmor, a marvelous land wherein is music. Its people are graceful, and nothing is called mine or thine. The plains of Ireland are fair, but fairer is this plain, its ale more intoxicating than that of Erin. There is choice of maiden wine, and conception is without sin or crime. Hence Segda in the story of Bikuma was son of a sinless couple. Its people are invisible. They see but are not seen, and none ever grows old. The magic food of the god's land will be Etain's, unsalted pork, new milk, and maid. Medea now met Eochaid and proposed a game of chess with him, allowing him to win, whereupon Eochaid demanded that Medea and his folk should perform 4 tasks: clear the plains of Meath, remove rushes, cut down the forest of Braig, and build a causeway across the moor of Lamrach. In the Din Censures, a topographical treatise, these tasks are an eric, or fine, on Medea for taking Eochaid's wife, and in performing them the divine folk taught a new custom to the men of Erin, that is, placing the yoke over the oxen's shoulders instead of on their foreheads, whence Yochaide's Congoman, Aram, or plowman. In the second game, Midir won and asked that he might hold Etain and kiss her. Eochaid would not consent until a month had passed, and then Midir arrived in splendor for his reward, surrounded by armies. Etain blushed when she heard his demand, but he reminded her that by no will of hers had he won her. "Take me then," said she, "if Yochaid is willing to give me up." "For that I am not willing," cried Yochaid, "but he may cast his arms around thee." So Midir took her, and then rose with her through the roof, and an assembly saw the pair as two swans winging their way to the Cid. The Egerton version ends by telling how through the divination of a druid, Yochaid discovered Midir's Cid, destroyed it, and recovered Etain. The version in the Liabhar na hi Uidre is defective after narrating how Eochaid and his men dug up several Cid one after another. But the Dinshenchas relates that S, Etain's daughter, brought tribute of cattle and was fostered by Midir for 9 years, during which Eochaid besieged the Cid, thwarted by his power. Midir brought out 60 women in Etain's form, among them S, Eochaid's daughter. But Eochaid mistook her for Etain, and by her had a daughter, Mesbuachalla, mother of Conair. Recognizing his mistake, he went to Midir, who restored Etain to him, and in revenge, Siugmal, Midir's grandson, afterwards killed Eochaid. Although folk tale formulae are found in the story, it is based on myths of divine love and magic power and of a goddess's rebirth as a mortal. Midir's poetic description of the god's land is archaic and may only later have been connected with the underground Cid. Curious too is the idea, which we have noted above, of the subjection of gods to mortals, performing tasks and permitting their abode to be spoiled or a consort taken from them. But it may reflect the belief in magic power to which even divinities must yield. Nevertheless, the deities got their own back. Etain's recapture is preceded by the incest incident. Midir is slain, and his descendant, Conair, dies because the god causes him to break his taboos, as already described. The story of the birth of the hero Cuchulainn is based on the love of a god, Lug, for a mortal, Dechter, sister of Conchobar, king of Ulster. It is told in 2 versions, one found in 2 recensions, the Liabhar de Nuidre and the Egerton manuscript. The other is also given in the Egerton manuscript. We follow the latter, noting the chief points of difference between it and the others. Dechtere, with 50 maidens, left Conchobar's house for 3 years, at last returning in the form of birds, which devoured everything, so that Conchobar organized a hunt, which continued unsuccessfully till nightfall. The other version begins with the devastation wrought by 9 flocks of mysterious birds, joined 2 and 2 by silver chains, the leading pair in each group being many-colored. But these birds are not Dechtere and her companions, for she accompanies Conchobar in his chariot on the hunt. The next incident is obscurely told in version C, but comparing it with the other, it is evident that the hunters entered a small house where were a man and a woman, and that it was suddenly enlarged, beautified, and filled with all desirable things, for it was one of the gods' magic dwellings, which they could produce on earth by glamour. The man was Lug, the woman Dechtere, though this was known only to Bricriu. Conchobar believed that they were his vassals and demanded his right of sleeping with the woman, who escaped by saying she was enceinte. And in the morning an infant was discovered, the child of Dectere by Lug, though it had the appearance of Conchobar. The child was called Setanta, but afterward was known as Cuchulainn. In version B, the host told his guests that his wife was in childbed. Dectere assisted her and took the child to foster him. And at the same time, the host's mare gave birth to 2 foals, a common folk tale coincidence. In the morning, all had vanished, and Conchobar's party returned home with the child, who died soon after. When the funeral was over, Dectere in drinking swallowed a mysterious tiny animal, and that night Lug appeared, telling her that she was with child by him, for it was he who had carried her off with her companions as birds, an incident lacking in this version. His was the child whom she had fostered, and now he himself had entered her as the little animal. Her child, when born, would be called Setanta. Here Setanta is at once Lug's son and his rebirth. But the 2 ideas are not exclusive if we take into account ancient ideas. In early Indian belief, the father became an embryo and was reincarnated in his firstborn son, whence funeral rites were performed for the father in the 5th month of pregnancy, and he was remarried after the birth. Probably for a similar reason, preserved in Celtic myth after it was no longer believed of mortals, a god who had a child by a mortal was thought to be reborn while still existing separately himself. And this explains why the Ulster men sought a wife for Cuchulainn, so that his rebirth might be of himself. In various texts, Cuchulainn is called son of Lug. When Dectere was found to be with child, it was thought that Conchobar himself was the father, for she slept by him, a glimpse of primitive manners in early Ireland. Elsewhere, Cuchulainn calls Conchobar his father, and this may represent another form of the story, with Conchobar as Cuchulainn's parent by his sister Dectere. Dectere was meanwhile affianced to Sual Tam, but ashamed of her condition, she vomited up the animal and again became a virgin. Yet the child whom she bore to Suatlam was the offspring of the 3 years' absence, Setanta or Cuchulainn. On the whole, this is a much distorted myth, but 2 things emerge from it: Lug's amour with Dectere and his fatherhood of Setanta. Another tale, with Christian interpolation, tells how Conla, son of Con, who reigned from 122 to 157 AD, one day saw a strange woman who announced that she was from Tir Nam Beo, the land of the living, where was no death, but perpetual feasting, and her people dwelt in a great Cid, whence they were called Aes Side, or people of the Cid. The goddess was invisible to all but Conla, whence Con asked him with whom he spoke, to which she replied that she was one who looked for neither death nor old age, and that she loved Conla and desired him to come to Magmel, the pleasant plain, where reigned a victorious king. Con bade his druids use powerful magic against her and her Brichtaban, or spells of women, against which at a later time Saint Patrick made his prayer. The druid pronounced an incantation to hinder Conla from seeing, and all others from hearing, the goddess, who withdrew after having an apple to Conla. He would eat nothing but this, nor did it ever grow less, and in a month the lovelorn Conla saw her reappear in a boat of glass, calling him to come, for the ever-living ones invited him, so that he might escape death. Con again called his druid, whereupon the goddess sang that the druids would soon pass away before a righteous one, Saint Patrick, a Christian interpolation, post eventum. And Conn then spoke to his son, but the goddess sang that once on the waves Connla's grief at leaving his friends would be forgotten, and the land of joy would soon be reached, where there were none but women. Connla sprang into the boat, which sped across the sea into the unknown, whence he has never returned. In this tale, the land of women is obviously but a part of the divine land, since that is ruled by a king. And there is no confusion between the idea of an overseas region of the immortals, Magmel, and that of the subterranean Cid. Connla's adventure is mentioned in the Coir Anman, or Fitness of Names, where another account is given, that is, that he was slain by enemies. A parallel myth, perhaps of Celtic origin, is found in one of the lays of Mary de France concerning the knight Lanval, with whom a fairy fell in love. When she declared herself, he sprang on horseback behind her and went away to Avalon, a beautiful island, the Elysium of the Brythonic Celts. The land of ever-living women recurs in some tales of the Im Rama, or romantic voyage, type. Example, in the Voyage of Maelduin, an old pagan story reconstructed in Christian times. Maelduin and his companions went on a quest for his father's murderers and met with the strangest adventures, one of which describes their arrival at an island where they saw 17 girls preparing a bath. A warrior appeared who, on bathing, proved to be a woman and sent one of the girls to bid the men enter her house. There a splendid repast was given them, and the woman, queen of the isle, desired each to take the girl who best pleased him, reserving herself for Maelduin. In the morning she begged all to remain. Their age would not increase. They would be immortal, and perpetual feasting and excessive love without toil would be theirs. She had been wife of the king of the island. The girls were her daughters, and now she reigned alone, so that she must leave them each day to judge cases for the people of the isle. The voyagers remained 3 months, when all but Maelduin grew homesick. Yet he consented to go with them, and all entered their boat in the queen's absence. Suddenly she appeared and threw out a rope, which Maelduin seized, with the result that they were drawn back to the shore, where they remained 3 months longer, escaping then once more. This time one of Maelduin's men caught the rope thrown by the queen, but the other severed his hand, and seeing this, she wept bitterly at their going. These women were not mortals, but goddesses, eager for the love of men. Another myth tells of a goddess's love, Kirkukulain. A flock of beautiful birds appeared in Ulster, and caused all the women to long for them. Cuchulainn, in distributing his catch among them, omitted his mistress Ethne, and to appease her, he promised that the 2 most beautiful birds which next appeared would be hers. Soon after, 2 birds linked together flew over the lake, singing a song which made everyone but Cuchulainn sleep. He pursued, but failing to catch them, he rested, angry in soul, against a stone, and while sleeping saw 2 women approaching, one in a green mantle and the other in a purple, each armed with a horsewhip with which they attacked him. When he was all but dead, his friends found him, and on his awaking he remained ill for a year. Then appeared a stranger who sang of the healing which could be given him by Ead Abrat's daughters, Liban and Fand, wife of Manannan. Fand desired his love. Would he but come to her wondrous land? And had he been her friend, none of the things seen by him in vision would have happened. The stranger, Oengus, son of Ead Abrat, disappeared, and after the Ulstermen had persuaded Cuchulainn to tell his vision, he was advised to return to the pillar stone. There he found Liban, who told him that Mananan had abandoned Fand, and she brought him a message from her own husband, Labraid, that he would give him Fand in return for 1 day's service against his enemies. Labraid dwelt in Magmel, and there Cuchulainn would recover his strength. But the hero desired his charioteer Loig first to go and report upon this land. At this point we hear of Loig's visit and return, and next follows a long passage that has nothing to do with the story, which then continues as if from another version in which Liban's visit had not occurred. Cuchulainn was still ill and sent Loig to tell Emer, his wife, how women of the city had destroyed his strength. But when she reproached him for his weakness, he arose and went to the enclosure, the pillar stone of the first part. There Liban appeared, singing of Labraid's prowess and of his need for Cuchulainn, and striving to lead the hero to the dwelling of the city, or to Labraid's home on a lake where troops of women came and went. Cuchulainn refused to go at a woman's call, whereupon Liban proposed that Loig should bring tidings of Labraid's land. The two visits of Loig are thus the same, but differently described. In the first, Liban took Loig by the shoulder, for he could not go in safety, unless under the protection of a woman. In a bronze boat, they reached an island in a lake, and in a palace Loig saw thrice 50 women who welcomed him. While he spoke of with Fand, Labraid arrived, gloomy because of the approaching contest, but Liban cheered him by announcing that Loig was there, and that Cuchulainn would come. Now Loig returned to tell of all he had seen. The other version describes how Loig passed with Liban to the plain of Fidga, where dwelt Aed Abrath and his daughters. There Fand bade him at once bring Cuchulainn, for on that day the strife would begin. And Loig returned, urging Cuchulainn to go and recounting what he had beheld. In one house were thrice 50 men. At the eastern gate were 3 purple trees with birds singing. In the forecourt was a silver tree with musical branches. From 60 other trees dropped food to nourish 300. And there was, too, a vat of unfailing ale. He described Fand's marvelous beauty, and still urged Cuchulainn with accounts of the attractiveness of the land, without any lie or injustice, and of the glory of its warriors and its women. Cuchulainn at last went there, and by his might quelled the enemies of the god. Fand and Liban now sang in praise of him, and he remained for a month with Fand, after which he bade her farewell. She appointed a tryst with him in Erin, but Emer heard of it, and with 50 women came to attack Fand. Cuchulainn, however, bade Fand have no fear, and addressing Emer, he told her how the goddess was more worthy of his love. Emer reproached him, and when she added, "If only I could find favour in thy sight," Cuchulainn's love for her returned. "Thou shalt find favour so long as I am in life." Then began a noble contest between Fand and Emer as to which of them should sacrifice herself for the other, and Fand sang a beautiful lament. At this moment Manannan became aware of Fand's predicament and arrived to rescue her, unseen by all save her and Loig. Fand again sang, describing the coming of the horsemen of the crested sea waves, and told of a former love for the god and the splendour of their espousals. Now, deserted by Cuchulainn, she would return to Manannan. But still her heart yearned for the hero, as she told Manannan when he asked her whether she would depart with him or no. Yet one thing weighed with her. Manannan had no consort worthy of him, while Cuchulainn already had Emer. So she departed, And when the hero knew it, he bounded thrice in air and gave 3 leaps southward, and abode for a long time fasting in the mountains. Emer went to Conchobar, who sent his druids to bind Cuchulainn. And when the hero would have slain them, they chanted spells and fettered him, giving him a draught of oblivion, so that he remembered found no more. Emer also shared in this potion and forgot her jealousy. And Manannan shook his mantle between Cuchulainn and Fand, so that they should never meet again. In this story, Emer addresses Loig as one who often searches the Cid, while he speaks of the divine land as well known to him and seems to see Manannan when he is invisible to the others. Manannan himself was an ardent lover, and what St. Patrick called a complicated bit of romance was told to him by Caerhillte. Ailinn of the Tuatha De Danann became enamored of Manannan's wife, while his sister Aine, daughter of Eogabil, loved Manannan and was dearer to him than all mankind. Aine asked the cause of her brother's sadness, and he told her that he loved the goddess Uchtdelb, or shapely bosom. Aine accordingly bade him come with her where the divine pair were, and taking her seat by Manannan, she gave him passionate kisses. Meanwhile, Uchtdelb, seeing Ailinn, loved him, and Manannan gave her to him, himself taking Aine. On another occasion Manannan desired Tuag, a maiden guarded by hosts of the king of Erin's daughters, and since no man might see her, Manannan sent a divine druid, Ferfiddail, son of Eogabil, in the form of a woman to gain access to Tuag. He remained with her 3 nights, and then, singing a sleep strain over her, he carried her to the shore, and left her slumbering while he looked for a boat wherein to carry her asleep to the land of ever-living women, or, in another version, to go to take counsel of Manannan. But a wave came and drowned her, the wave in one version being Manannan the sea god himself, a primitive piece of personalization of nature. For his misdeed, Ferfiddail was slain by Manannan, and probably the cause of offence was that he had loved Tuag, this explaining why she was drowned by the disappointed god. A parallel myth connected with other personages tells how Clinda the Shapely went from the Hill of the Two Wheels in the pleasant plain of the Land of Promise with Eachna Curly Locks to go to Oengus Mac Ind Ok. But Eachna practiced guile upon her so that she slept in the boat of bronze through his music. And then he turned the boat's head, altering its course till it reached the place called Clinda. At that time occurred one of the 3 great sea bursts which spread through all the world. It caught up the boat, and Clinda was drowned. Whence this sea burst was called Clinda's wave. The others were Tuag's and Ruadreige's, or Lardru's and Bailey's. The story of Crimthan Nia Nair shows that one who sojourns in the divine land or tastes its food may not be able to return to earth with impunity, for he has become a member of the other world state and is no longer fit for earth. This is found in other Irish tales and in stories of fairyland or the world of the dead elsewhere. Crimthan was son of Lugai Red Stripes, of whom one of those occasional stories of incest, not uncommon in primitive society, is told, proving that it had at one time been common in Celtic custom, perhaps in the royal house. Lugaid's mother was Clothru, a sister of Medb and Ethne. Clothru and Ethne are both said to have been wives of Conchobar after Medb left him for Ailill, and their brothers, Bres, Nar, and Lothar, were called the 3 Finns, or White Ones, of Emuin. Once Clothru bewailed her childless condition to them, and as a result of her entreaties, she had a son Lugaid by all three. Clothru again bore a child to Lugaid, Crimthan Nianair, or Norse man, the hero of the story and afterward supreme king, who fared on what is called a splendid adventure with a goddess or witch called Nar. He went to a land overseas, where he remained with her for a month and a half, and at his departure he obtained many love tokens: a chariot and a golden draught board, a sword richly ornamented, a spear whose wounds were always mortal, a sling which never missed its aim, 2 dogs worth 100 female slaves, and a beautiful mantle. Soon after his return, however, he fell from his horse and died, an incident perhaps to be explained in terms of the myths of Lugaid, Liban, and Oisin, who, in order to return to the divine land, were warned not to dismount from their horses. On the other hand, Cuchulainn was able to return to Ireland from Elysium without hurt, and so also was Aed, son of the King of Leinster, who was enticed into the Cid by Bob Dearg's daughters. For 3 years the folk of the Cid cared for him, while his father mourned, not knowing whither the divine people had taken him, into the sky or down under the earth. He and 50 other youths escaped, however, and Aed met Saint Patrick, who restored him to his father and said that he would eventually die as God willed, that is, the Tuatha De Danann would have no further power over him. Sometimes mortals, or gods later envisaged as mortals, abducted daughters of gods. Garman took Bod's daughter Meska from the Cid, but she died of shame, and the plain where her grave was dug was named after her, Mag Meska. Men of the Cid, divine or semi-divine beings, but regarded as attendants on men, also had love affairs with goddesses. Cleach, from Cid Bene, was harper to the king of the 3 Rosses, and made music at the Cid of Femen to attract Conchin, Bod's daughter. For a year Bod's magic prevented the lover from approaching nearer, so that he could do nothing to the girls in the Cid. But he harped until earth opened, and a dragon issued forth, when he died in terror. This dragon will arise at the end of the world and afflict Ireland in vengeance for Saint John Baptist, perhaps an altered fragment of an old cosmogonic myth. Another story has some resemblance to this. Liath, a young prince of the Cide, loved Midir's daughter Bree, who went with her attendants to meet him as he approached. But the slingers on Midir's Cid kept him back, and their sling stones were like a swarm of bees on a day of beauty. Liath's servant was slain, and because Liath could not reach her, Bree turned back to the Cid and died of a broken heart. Besides these, a large number of Irish and Welsh tales illustrate the amours of the gods, as may be seen elsewhere in this volume.